My grandma died in 2013, and I moved into her house due to inheritance. In the back of the house are French doors that lead to the porch, which my grandma would sit on every day. The handles and locks are very loud when they're turned, and every once in a while, I'll hear the familiar sound of the door being unlocked, the handle being turned. And I'll go to the doors and see that one is open, without fail. I close them so as not to let hot or cold air in, depending on the season. And minutes later, sometimes it'll happen again. At first, it scared me, but now it makes me happy to know that she's still with me. I haven't thought about this in years, but another story jogged my memory. When I was a kid, I was absolutely, blindingly terrified of going into my bedroom and the hallway. Like so scared I would literally be paralyzed. If my parents would tell me to change the thermostat, I would do it, because I didn't want to get a spanking, but I'd have to crawl out of the hallway because I'd melt with fear. I used to hear voices and see shadows of people. I'm an only child, so it wasn't siblings or anyone else living in the house. One day, I went to the garage to get a screwdriver. The garage was closed, but there was a shadow of an extraordinarily tall man in the center of the garage. The light was on, but where the person should have been standing, it was dim, and all I could see was a shadow. I screamed and ran inside. After that, I was even more terrified of my house. I never wanted to be left alone. I eventually was shamed by my family, friends, for my fear. I went into my room to cry because they were making fun of me. I was like 9. At that moment, I felt the shadows and voices, but they didn't scare me. They made me feel warm and unafraid. I was never afraid again. I love road trips. There's nothing more delightful to me than to get up an hour before the sunrise and hit the road to a destination some 100 miles in the distance. However, there are occurrences in the wee hours when time gets thin and reality blurs around the edges. I'd like to share 3 of these stories that all share a phenomenon I've come to call the screaming between. The first was during my move from North Carolina to California. I made it in a 4-day blitz across the continental U.S., which I was pretty proud of. Day 1 passed with no trouble, moving from Goldsboro, North Carolina, to Prattville, Alabama, in just 12 hours. Day 2, I got all the way from Prattville to Baton Rouge, and I knocked off early to enjoy some gumbo. Day 3 was the day that I heard it. It was about 4 in the afternoon, with a relatively clear day all around me. October isn't the hottest time in Texas, but my AC had quit working, so I had the windows down. V&V Nation's Nemesis was blaring out of my shitty Honda Civic speakers when I heard a god-awful shrieking. It was like the sound of a big sheet of steel being torn lengthwise. In a panic, I pull over into a small turnabout on the side of I-10. And before I can even figure out what's going on, rain is hitting my car. A couple drops, then a torrent, and just ahead of me where the road dips a bit, I see a runnel of water start. I look to my left, down to the south, and this massive thunderhead is pulling from behind a butte, and this wall of water is starting to pour across the road.
I never saw anything like that before, and I was stranded for a good 40 minutes as this flash flood poured not about 20 feet ahead of my car, across the road. The next time was a road trip to Idaho, from my new home in California. I took the route up through Nevada, via Amboy and Vegas, figuring I could do the trip in about a day since the GPS predicted 12 to 13 hours for a drive. The snow was starting to come down, as this was a Christmas trip, my favorite time of the year to take these journeys, visit family and friends. I had gotten roughly halfway there, around the town of Wells. It's honestly a bunch of truck stops and hotels, more of a stopover than a real town. And I was starting to get drowsy. I'd taken longer than expected due to the major traffic holdup a few hours before, and it was already pitch black around 11:30 p.m. I had just rolled down the window to let a blast of cool air invigorate me when I heard it, that same horrifying shriek sound. I jerked the wheel reflexively, and I skidded off the road. At exactly that moment, an oncoming semi drifted right into the lane that I'd been in. The last story is another Christmas road trip. This time, I was going from California all the way to Illinois, and just my luck, a winter storm comes tearing along I-70 just as I'm getting on during day 2 of my trip. It was insane. I'd gone from a slightly snowy but mostly clear day in Utah to near whiteout conditions in under an hour. Now, I'm perfectly comfortable driving in the snow, and my SUV had its snow chains, 4-wheel drive, everything in good condition. I'd replaced the Honda Civic a while back. So I figure I can keep going. A few hours more, at least. Then, of course, I hear it. That infernal hell shriek of a sound. This time, I could swear I heard it saying 13 as it screamed through the winter snow. By this time, I'm entirely out of fucks to give when it comes to that screaming, so I hit the next exit and ducked into a hotel, even though it was only 7 p.m., and I'd been on the road for less than 9 hours. The next day, as I'm driving, I counted 12 vehicles on the side of the road, overturned and wrecked, each one with massive gashes on the sides of their vehicle, like they'd been peeled back by a horrible force. I still love road trips, but part of me is always listening for that screaming when I'm between towns.
Back in 2014, when I was a teenager, I was still living in my small town in Europe, Bulgaria. Me and my childhood friends, 2 boys and 1 girl, would sometimes take walks along a highway, one which wasn't used very frequently. Most of the time, we would see a few trucks pass by, but it wasn't full of traffic, and it was very close to where I lived, so it was just something we'd often do. On the left side of it, there were houses. On the right side, there was a huge empty field with some hills here and there, but most of the land was empty, full of grass. On the right side where the field was, there was an old abandoned canal, which hadn't been used since the early 90s. It was full of trash and sticks, and it was also used to dispose of bones of farm animals such as goats and sheep. There weren't so many, and yeah, it's creepy, but we knew they were from animals. We visited before in the daytime. Nothing impressive, really. Just an empty hole. One ordinary night, we decided to go on another walk along the highway. We went to the end once and then came back. We got bored since we were always doing the same thing. Someone had the idea to go along the small dirt road, which is alongside the abandoned canal, and we did, without giving it much thought. Now, have in mind that on the highway, there are streetlights, But on the small dirt road alongside this canal, there's no light coming from anywhere. It was a full moon as far as I remember, since it wasn't pitch black. And we could see where we were going without using our phones. Anyways, we were walking, joking, laughing, just having a really good time. One of the boys went ahead of us, since he was walking faster. Me and the other boy and the other girl were behind him, walking a bit slower. At the middle of the dirt road, the three of us decide to go back to the well-lit area on the highway. And we called to the other guy to come back as well. A few minutes passed and the boy was ahead. He was almost at the end of the dirt road when he started running towards us, screaming,
"You guys, run!"
So instinctively, we all turned around to see what's going on, and we just froze. We saw him running very fast towards us, and there was something behind him, following him. Everyone managed to brush it off and run toward the highway, except for me. I stood there for a few more seconds, trying to figure out what we were witnessing. It's very hard to describe. It was a figure that somehow was shining bright, white light, moving up and down, coming towards us. When I realized I couldn't figure out what I was seeing, I turned my back towards it, and I ran so fast that I passed the others, even though they had started running before me. We didn't stop until we reached the streetlights, and when we did, we turned around. There was nothing behind us anymore. We were terrified at first, but then we just dropped the subject and never spoke of it again. None of us shared this with anybody outside of our childhood group, since we thought people would start rumors that we're taking drugs, etc. It was a very small town. A couple of years went by. We grew up and everyone started moving out to the bigger cities in the area. So at one point, I was the only person from our childhood group left in our hometown, since I was the youngest of us four. In 2017, I was hanging outside in my hometown with some friends, a completely different group of people who were never friends with my old group of friends. We started talking about random stuff, and then it got dark outside, and one of the guys suggested that we should share spooky stories. Then he started talking, and he shared how recently he and 3 other boys were hanging out during the night alongside the dirt road next to the abandoned canal. At this point, I was all ears. He then proceeded to describe how exactly the same thing happened to them, how they were just hanging out there, and then some weird figure, a shining, bright white thing, came towards them. They got scared and ran away, and then when they looked back, the figure had disappeared. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My jaw dropped to the ground. Then I shared that a couple of years back, me and 3 other friends experienced the exact same thing, in the very same place. I asked him if these other people had talked to him about it, and if this was some kind of joke, but it wasn't. The story doesn't exactly end here. I went home that night, still stunned, and I barely slept. I kept remembering what happened years ago, and I was trying to figure things out, but I thought of nothing that made sense. What we experienced was just unexplainable. So the next day, I decided to share everything with my parents, and I honestly thought that they might just brush it off, say that we were just too scared and imagined something. But to my surprise, they were both just staring at me, horrified. I asked them why they weren't saying anything, and why they were just staring at me. Then they told me how, back in the early 90s, when they were teenagers themselves, 2 kids went missing. A 7-year-old girl and a 3-year-old boy. Before they went missing, these kids lived right next door to our apartment, in the house that was facing our balcony. Since it's a small town, everyone thought that the kids would be found soon. But 5 years passed by, and there was no sign of them. Nobody had heard anything. There were no suspects in the kidnapping or any leads as to what happened to them. Then, in the 5th year of their disappearance, their remains were found in the abandoned canal, and by the evidence found there, it was concluded that they had been murdered, but the killer was never found. My parents said this event really shook the community back then, and a lot of people avoided going near the canal since it happened. The curious teens were occasionally visiting it and sharing stories of how they'd seen something unexplainable. However, nobody believed them. To this day, when I visit my hometown and pass by the canal, I feel so uneasy. And I don't even think about going alongside the dirt road, not after knowing what really happened there. This story is about my old, haunted house. So basically, my house was haunted by an old woman who lived there before, and she died around August in the house. Every morning, my mom would wake up and see that the calendar was flipped to August, and every day, she would flip it back. Her coffee would be made for her, and it would still be hot. And when we moved, all of the woman's clothes were behind our dresser. Mind you, we already cleaned the house completely, including the dresser, but it was all folded and smelled like fresh clothes out of the dryer. So, that was weird. But anyways, I was playing with my cousin, and he threw my stepdad's hat at me from the other side of the bed, and it hit my face. Then I screamed in terror when I saw a white glowing hand cover my face. I threw the hat down and passed out after. I woke up, and my cousin asked what had happened. So I told him what I saw, and he said he had a dream the night before of the same hand trying to kill him in his sleep. He said he didn't want to freak me out by telling me this because I have to live in the house. Ever since I can remember, I've felt something with me. Ghost or not, it doesn't scare me, but it likes to play jokes. One of the instances that stands out was about 10 years ago. I was still living with my parents at the time, and I decided to cook dinner. I love to cook, so it was never a chore, but I hate peeling potatoes. My dad has never minded peeling them for me, so we went into the kitchen together to prepare the dinner. Our kitchen bar was an L shape, and the little part of the L was always clear, except when we were preparing food. My dad and I started getting everything out of the cabinets that we would need. He then asked me if I'd seen any of the potato peelers. I told him no, but I would help him look. My mom is just like me in the fact that everything has a place, so I thought this task would be simple. But my father and I look in the drawer where they usually are, and then the dishwasher, and then the dish strainer. We were beginning to get frustrated. We started looking in the cabinets and other places that we knew they weren't supposed to be, but it was worth a shot. While my dad was at the other end of the kitchen, I bent down to look in the cabinets under the small part of the L, and my dad called my name. I stood up and looked at him, and with my back toward the bar, he had a blank stare on his face and was just pointing. I turned to see what he was pointing at, and on the edge of the bar, 2 of the potato peelers were neatly placed side by side. A more recent event happened a couple of weeks ago. A little bit of a side note, my husband absolutely hates to misplace or lose things. One morning, we'd gotten up, made our bed, and went to the kitchen for breakfast. On top of our freshly made bed, my husband placed his wallet to come back for later. After breakfast, he said he needed to go to the store, and and proceeded to our bedroom while I stayed in the kitchen, cleaning up. All of a sudden I heard, "You've got to be kidding me." I smiled because I knew what had happened. He came back into the kitchen and asked if any of our children had been in the bedroom. I replied that they had gotten out of bed and been in the kitchen the entire time. After 10 years of being with me, the last thing he thinks of is my friend, as he calls it, hiding things. I told him I would go and help him look, so we headed back to the room to look. We looked under the bed, on our dressers, in the bathroom, and then slowly took off every layer of the bed. At the end of the search, still no wallet, and the cover and sheets lay in a big pile at the head of the bed. Being the OCD man that he is, and hating that something had disappeared, he tried to convince me and himself that maybe he sat it in the living room or kitchen. To humor him, I followed him through the house, searching room by room, even the rooms we both knew he didn't go in. By this time, he was angry. I told him it would turn up, and that I was going to go make the bed again. As soon as I stepped in the door, I called for him to come. Lying on the top of the mound of covers lay his wallet. He doesn't like my friend.
"7 years ago, my older sister passed away. She unfortunately took her own life. Her passing was extremely difficult on my family, especially my mother, who my siblings and I are very close with. There's nothing worse in life than trying to hold and comfort your mother while watching her whole world crumble and burn, knowing you yourself are dealing with your own trauma, because I was the one who found her body that day. 2 weeks after her death, she was cremated, and her ashes were divided 3 ways. Some went to my dad. My parents had been divorced since I was 5. Some went into an urn for my brother, my mom, and I, and the rest went into a necklace for my mom. My mom and brother asked me if I wanted some of her ashes, but part of me thought if I kept them, she wouldn't be completely free. So I chose not to keep some. About a year later, my brother was living in Oregon with his girlfriend, Ingrid. My mom decided to let my brother have my sister's ashes until he decided to move back to our hometown. One day, while they were rearranging their room, my brother, who always kept my sister's ashes on a dresser by his bed, put them in the closet so they didn't get knocked over while they were moving furniture. At night around 2 a.m., Ingrid said she had trouble staying asleep, while my brother was knocked out beside her. She said she was laying there for about 10 minutes, when out of nowhere, she heard my brother mumbling something. Thinking he's awake, she turns on the light and sees that he's fast asleep. After a few minutes of looking at him and being slightly creeped out by his sleep talking, she turns off the light and lays back down. Another 10 minutes go by, when out of nowhere, and clear as day, she hears my brother say, "Take my sister out of the closet. She doesn't like it in there." She says she froze and was scared to turn on the light for a second time. She says she just lays there for a moment before gathering up the courage to turn on the light. To her surprise, she sees that my brother is completely asleep and drooling a little. She said her eyes immediately look at the closet that is closed. She says that she gets up, opens the closet, and sees my sister's urn on the shelf. She takes the urn and places it on the dresser where it was before they put it in the closet. The next day, when she's telling the story to my mom, she says that morning she asked my brother if he remembers anything about last night, to which he replies, "No, I don't even remember falling asleep." Later that day, while my mom is at work, she's telling her coworker this story, and the coworker says that when you keep someone's ashes, you're supposed to keep them somewhere that people gather, like a living room. Since this incident,
My brother now keeps my sister's ashes in his living room, in a beautiful urn, on a shelf next to her picture, with a candle that's always lit, electronically. A few years before she passed, she and I would watch Ghost Adventures religiously, and we vowed that when one of us passed away first, that person would haunt the shit out of the other. I find it funny that she used my brother to scare the shit out of his girlfriend, who didn't know about our agreement from years before. My mom grew up in Huntington, New York, in a haunted house. It was normal for her to hear people running in circles at night, and apparently, they'd even see footprints in the carpet in the morning. One story my mom told me was about how when she was little, she was playing in the backyard and found a wooden nail. She didn't think much of it, so she threw it over the fence and went on with her day. When my mom woke up the next morning, the same wooden nail she threw over the fence was on her nightstand. When I was younger, I remember my mom having a mirror in her room that would sometimes show faces and shadows that weren't there. This wasn't only at night, so over the years I've ruled out the possibility that these experiences were dreams. I was very little, but what I was seeing wasn't something of a child's imagination. I was a relatively sheltered child, meaning I hadn't seen horror movies or scary things outside of costumes during the holiday season, which weren't scary to me. What I saw in the mirror, that was scary to me. Some background. I come from, and at the time I lived in an old mining town, Farmington, West Virginia. In 1968, there was a pretty big explosion in the Mount Hope mine. It ended up killing 78 men, while only 21 managed to make it out alive. Most all of these men were locals. This was an up-and-running mining town, years before the explosion. So what this had essentially done to our very small town was take out an entire generation of men, for some families. So what my mom saw growing up was a town with a lot of widows and not a lot of children. But when I was growing up, what I saw was a lot of old people, mainly women, some kids, and a whole lot of estate sales. Makes sense when you put together that a lot of these people had either outlived their family or had never had children, leaving most of their physical belongings to the state. Enter the mirror. My mom had found it at one of these estate sales and she couldn't let it go. It was an old mirror, but fancy carvings, and it had deep reddish wood. The front opened, making it a sort of extra-large jewelry box. Before the mirror, my mom had a small TV stand and TV that sat at the foot of her bed. So at night, I'd grab a stuffed animal or two, and I'd just curl up at the foot of her bed and watch TV. After my mom moved the TV into the front room, she put the mirror in its place in her room. Still fixed on my routine, I decided that I would sleep at the foot of my mom's bed, this time bringing a flashlight with my stuffed animals, along with a book. Falling asleep was no problem, but I started to experience waking up for no reason. I remember waking up, barely having my eyes open, but seeing faces in the mirror. I'd open my eyes wider, trying to rub them, but the faces wouldn't go away. I couldn't make out any details like eye color or hair color. It was just like seeing the imprint of a face, sometimes silver and resembling the texture of water.
sometimes black like a shadow, and other times white like a sheet. What I remember more than any feature is being so scared that I had to jump into bed with my mom. But most of the time, the faces would stay in the mirror, moving their position from lower to higher, as I did. There was a period of time where I tried to tell my mom about the faces. She told me it was probably because I kept smushing my face into the mirror and that I was leaving an imprint, or if it was at nighttime, that it must have been a dream. I understood quickly that my mom clearly couldn't see what I was seeing. Then the shadow started happening, and I was no longer alone. I was usually in my mom's room because that's where my cats liked to sleep during the day, so I'd always find myself in there, sprawled out on her bed, petting the cats. When I would get up, I'd usually catch a glimpse of something in the mirror, looking like a shadow passing by, but nothing to make a shadow. The first time that this happened, I froze in fear. I thought something was in the room with me. But after several moments, I realized I was alone, at least alone in this room. But there was a shadow in the mirror. It only seemed to be showing a sliver of itself to the far right, my right. I kept looking from the mirror and then next to me. It wasn't adding up. I'm not sure how I gained the courage to leave the room that time, but I did, running from her room down the stairs. After that time, I just got used to it. The shadow and the faces. I kinda hated them, but I was used to them. And so one day, my mom calls me from her room. I was in my room. I scooted my way down the hall, and she looked puzzled, asking if I was just in there, meaning, was I just in her room? I told her no, that I was in my room the whole time. She shrugged this off the first time, but when it happened more than once, she started to ask questions about the stories I would tell her about the mirror. So I repeated that I would sometimes see faces. I was more articulate now, so my descriptions of their colors and textures, it was better. She seemed to listen more, and sometimes we'd be sitting in her room, and she'd ask me, "Did you see that?" When a shadow would go by. I had seen it, and each time it was like confirmation that something was happening. After a while, I guess I stopped paying much attention to the mirror, and I thought my mother did too. The mirror was damaged while we were moving several years later. It was weird. When I heard it was damaged, I actually felt sad. And when I saw my mom, she was devastated, as I guess that she'd grown a bit attached to it, a bit more than I even knew until it was gone. It's hard to explain, but I don't have a lot of memories growing up. I mean, I remember some things, but I can never usually recall what I did for a certain birthday, who my teachers were. I even have a hard time remembering the kinds of shows that were on TV, or my friends' faces. But I have vivid memories of the faces and the shadows in the mirror. It's like when I talk about them, I'm transported right back to the front of that mirror, seeing these faces and shadows, my knees feeling like jello. I don't really know what to make of it all. It really was the strangest thing.
So maybe somebody can make sense out of this. When I was 14, my friend and I were hanging out at my house. My parents had left to go see some friends, so we were left alone, which was pretty normal. We were older kids and we weren't really up to anything shitty for the most part. All we generally did was order pizza and play video games. I have a habit where I close the door to my room. It's a habit I got because as long as I can remember, I always felt a weird vibe in my old house, so it added a false sense of security by closing it. While we were playing, I started hearing some scratching on the door. I have a dog, so I didn't think anything of it. I went over to open the door, assuming my dog would just come in for a little bit, but he wasn't there. Again, I didn't think anything of it, because my dog was a little bit older. He liked hanging out inside in his little igloo-shaped bed and kept to himself for the most part. Sometimes he'd come out in a good mood and want to play, but he was usually asleep. On cooler nights, my parents would leave him in the backyard because he would dig around and explore and have fun. Because he wasn't there, I just closed the door and kept on playing video games with my friend. 20 minutes later, give or take, the scratching started again. So I went to the door, and again, he wasn't there. Maybe I'm just worrying about him too much. I'm thinking I hear him scratching. So I went over to check on him, and lo and behold, he was actually outside in the backyard, because it was a cooler night after all. With that said, I chalked it up to my imagination, and even though I was unnerved by this, I decided to keep it to myself. So an hour passes by and we're playing video games again. As usual, we've been at it for a while, and I almost forgot about the whole thing by this point, but the scratching started again. I just proceeded to ignore it. It kept going for a little bit, and at some point my friend looked at me and said, "Dude, why don't you just let your dog in?" I explained what's been going on, and he was pretty freaked out by the whole thing, but also thought that I was just fucking around. With the door closed, the scratching kept going. And we just ignored it and played quietly, but very nervous. After some time, the scratching stops and the lights go out. We hear sounds like a vase breaking in the house. But I'm convinced that it's a window because we don't have a vase. I tried calling my father because the landline still worked, and he tells me that he'll be on his way soon with my mom. After I hang up with him, a few minutes later, the lights come back on. So my friend and I proceed to start looking around the house. Everything is intact and undisturbed. My dog is barking crazily, and I let him in. I'm walking to my room, which is close to the entrance of the front door, and I notice that the latch is unlocked. I am 100% certain I locked it, because I always double check. To this day, I still have no idea what the fuck happened. My friend and I lost touch, but I did see him many years later, and I asked him if he remembered that day. He just looked at me and laughed and said, "How could I forget?" We still can't make heads or tails of what happened, and I still get goosebumps thinking about that night. We left the house years later when my parents divorced. I'm reaching out because if anyone here knows anything about that, has an explanation that makes sense, or even experienced the same shit and has more answers than I do, I would appreciate it. I'll start off with a bit of backstory. I was in the second grade during the time of this story, and now I'm 23. My mom and then stepdad moved into a house in Seminole, Florida, which had originally belonged to 3 older ladies that were sisters, who eventually passed on, leaving the house to go up for sale. The house was extremely outdated. My parents got it for cheap, using extra money to renovate and update the house. A few things that stuck out to me before my parents started renovating. All the light switch covers had the Virgin Mary imprinted on them, an emblem saying "In God We Trust," or a cross. In the living room, the biggest wall had wallpaper on it, with a scene of village people from what seemed like the 1800s. Crosses hung above every doorway or entrance to each room. My mom also kept a neat antique bookcase that was left there before we moved in. On to the story of things I experienced in this house. We would receive mail addressed to all of the sisters, separate envelopes with each name. And they would include 1 penny taped to each typed letter. I remember one of the names being Josephina. After watching the Halloween episode of Zack and Cody, where Esteban calls spirits through a crystal ball, I thought it would be fun to gather my parents and act out the scene. Holding my parents' hands, I called out, "Josephina, if you're here, give me a sign." After I was done being silly, I went to my room, and as soon as I flipped the light switch on, one of the light bulbs made a loud popping sound and went out. I used to wake up in the middle of the night regularly, scared from a bad dream or something silly, and to feel safe, I would turn my TV on and eventually fall back to sleep. One night, after waking up, I was watching TV and heard some fidgeting in the living room. My door was halfway open, and the living room was across from my bedroom. The doors in the house were wood and hollow in the center, making any tap on them fairly loud and deep. After hearing the fidgeting, I'm still looking at the open space between the frame and the door, and there was a loud smack on the door, pushing it open a little bit more. But there was absolutely no one there. My parents were sleeping, and we had no animals. At 8:20 p.m. every night, 8 p.m. was my bedtime, and I had a clock on my nightstand, I would feel a light pressure rub against the top of the covers at the end of my bed, over my feet. No one was there, but it happened at the same time every night, as if maybe whatever spirit was in the house was saying goodnight.
I currently live in the house that I grew up in. It's over 30 years old, and while living here, many unexplained things have happened. Nowadays, I'm incredibly attached to the home, and I could never imagine selling it. Since it's been literally 20 years of on-again, off-again experiences, I'm not really creeped out by them anymore. However, that wasn't always the case. Take the time that I was just 8 years old, my first experience. We'd just moved into the house, and it was one of our first nights actually staying the night with all of our furniture. I remember that it wasn't that late because we'd just finished eating dinner, and the news was on, but it was dark outside. I was sitting in my dad's recliner, listening to him and my mom laugh in the kitchen as they washed the dishes. And I was watching the news. Realizing that I didn't want to watch the news, I started to feel around for the remote. Then I noticed it was still next to the TV. Feeling lazy, I called out to my mom and dad to see if they would come and hand it to me. They didn't answer, so I assumed they couldn't hear me. Instead of screaming, I decided to get up. But right when I stood up, something pulled me back into the recliner. I looked up, and all I saw was black. It was a deep, black, shadow-type figure. No features, just the outline of shoulders and the shape of a head, large and round. Within moments, I felt my eyes become so heavy that I struggled to keep them open. And before I knew it, everything was black. The next time I opened my eyes, I saw my parents sitting on the couch next to the recliner. They were just watching TV. I felt incredibly groggy, asking my parents what happened. They just sort of looked at me, at each other, smiled, and my mom said, "What do you mean? You fell asleep, sweetheart." But I hadn't fallen asleep. Had I? I mean, I was completely awake, and then that thing. Being a kid, when I told my parents what happened, it was explained to me that I had a dream. Except, I'd had dreams before,
This was not that. Then there was the bathroom downstairs, or the downstairs basement in general. At first it was just a toilet and a sink, sort of dark and not inviting. There were some things that were left in the basement, among them a mirror, various large picture frames, curtains, random things. My mom put up the mirror and she put a houseplant in the bathroom. This made it all a little less creepy. I remember being downstairs working on a project for science class when I had to pee. I darted into the bathroom, handled business, and as I was washing my hands, I glanced in the mirror and saw in the reflection someone standing outside the bathroom door, hovering over my project. I assumed my mom, but then I got that same feeling. Heavy eyes, so heavy I couldn't keep them open. I turned around and could see that the figure was just standing there. I tried to walk out of the bathroom, but towards the basement staircase. But before I could even fully exit the room, everything was dark. I woke up to my mother now standing over me, relieved that I had opened my eyes. My mom scheduled an appointment with the doctors after I had told her what had happened. When I compared it to the time that I was in the chair, I guess that's what worried her, that something was going on neurologically. But that doctor visit turned into another doctor visit, only to be told that I was fine. Nothing to indicate anything was wrong with my brain on any of the various scans that they had done. I do recall trying to explain the situation to the doctors, but it didn't seem to click with any adults that I talked to. They all seemed to assume this was a nightmare of some kind, but this was happening at hours that I would normally be wide awake. But almost every time that I would be in the basement alone, something strange would take place. I would always feel like something was there. Or like the time I was walking up the stairs and I saw a full-on hand reach out through the stairs, attempting to grab my leg. I shrieked and I ran up the stairs as fast as I could. I didn't tell my parents about this one, but I wouldn't have to. When I was in the 8th grade, I remember hearing my mother scream from downstairs. I was in my room, and as I ran out, I met my dad in the hallway, who looked at me, concerned. When we got to the area of the house where the basement door was, my mom was standing there, with her back against the door, breathing heavily. She's shooting my dad the craziest look, like she's mad but she's terrified. My dad is now walking up to her and asking if she's all right. She breaks eye contact with him to look at me for just 1 second, then back to my dad, telling him that she needs to speak with him in the other room. Of course, I eavesdropped on the entire conversation, where I heard my mom tell my dad that there was someone under the stairs, that she saw a hand reach out as she was walking up. She tells him that she dropped all of the laundry and she locked the door. My dad demands to call the police, and she tells him no, it was a child. They're both quiet for a minute. When I hear them start to walk back, I scoot as far away as I can, but I'm still in view of the door. When they make their way into view, I walk over, but my mom tells me to stop. She tells me to go watch TV. I don't. Instead, I watch them go downstairs, while my dad calls out and my mom closes the door. Eventually, they come back up the stairs and are talking about how they just don't know, and that was the strangest thing, and then they shush themselves as they see me. They didn't talk to me about it then, but years later, I confirmed with my mom that she had seen what I had seen, and she confirmed it wasn't the only time that she had seen that child. Yes, child. I knew the hand looked small, but I never saw a full-on being, but she had.
I focused on these two experiences, the shadow entity and the hand, because they were the things that really freaked me out. Throughout living here, though, it's far more than just those. It's been the sound of running up and down the stairs when no one is running. Like most occurrences, I was the first to notice, but also, like most occurrences, my parents caught on too. The shadows that you would always see just out of the corner of your eye. Each time I did, I would feel uneasy just for a second, wondering if I was going to pass out. But these glimpses felt different. Not as dark, literally in color, but also in the lack of feeling that came over me. Over time, the activity really dulled down. I do remember throughout my teen years having trouble with sleep, paralysis, insomnia, sleepwalking, but I seemed to grow out of that too. It wasn't until sometime last year, 2019, while talking with my mom, that we had the first occurrence we'd had in a while. We were together in the kitchen, and my mom brought up all the weirdness that used to happen in the house, talking about how strange it was that a lot of it had stopped when my dad passed away. He died of a heart attack back in 2014, and she had a good point. I hadn't thought about it like that, but it had been years. We started to reminisce about a lot of things, like how, when my dad first passed, we'd seen dimes placed in random places. Places like my vanity, right in the middle, or on my dad's side of the bed. We'd like to believe that my dad had left them there. Well, on this night, after cleaning the kitchen, we were both shocked and definitely emotional when we saw a dime sitting on the edge of the kitchen counter.
For the past year or two, my mother has had several experiences in our house. She'll often hear what sounds like dogs walking on hardwood out in the kitchen, even though all the dogs are in the living room with her. Most recently, this past Wednesday morning, she saw a shadow next to her spot on the couch. The most common one, though, is that she will hear the side door close, like my dad has gotten home, except he hasn't. She's not hearing things either, as the dogs catch it too, and they go over to greet him, only for him not to be there. Speaking of dogs, quite often they will sit and stare up at the ceiling, or into a corner. No growling or anything, just staring. My mom cleans religiously, so there are no cobwebs or anything that could be catching their eyes. I moved in last October after my divorce with my 3 dogs, and I've had a couple experiences myself. On Thanksgiving of last year, we noticed that the clock on the wall in the dining room, that has had dead batteries for years, had one hand sticking straight up at the 12, where previously both had been at the 6. The hallway that leads to the side door and the laundry room and the office that I slept in always gave me the creeps. I'm constantly feeling like I'm being watched. My most recent experience was just 2 days ago. My parents were on vacation in Florida and had just texted me that they were on their way home from the airport. I was in my room playing video games, with my 3 dogs on the bed with me, and their 3 on the floor next to the bed. I'm about to go back to my game when I heard what sounded like a dog growling. Not unusual in a house with 6 dogs, but very unusual when the sound is coming from the kitchen. Attached to that same hallway as the laundry room and office. and all 6 dogs are with me, and none of them sound like that when they growl. The creepiest one, though, occurred shortly after Christmas of 2020. My mother and I both came down with COVID, and we were quarantined in our rooms. I was still sleeping in the office at the time. About midnight comes, and my dad leaves for a fire call. We're both volunteer firefighters, and for obvious reasons, I didn't go. I'm still awake watching TV and listening to the call on my radio. Dad had left the hallway light on when he left. And when I looked over at my dogs, because they're cute as fuck when they're sleeping, I saw a shadow pass my door, blocking the light from the hallway. At this point, it's about 12:30. My dad is still out on a call, and Mom is long asleep. Their 3 dogs are with Mom in her room, and my 3 are in mine. Right after the shadow passes, one of my dogs stares at the door and starts growling. Now, this dog barks and grumbles a lot, but never like this. This was a full-on, "Who are you? Get the fuck out of my house," growl. Needless to say, I didn't sleep until Dad got home and turned out the light. No way in hell was I getting out of bed and opening that door. At this point, I'm not sure how many entities we have around. I think it's at least 3. One being one of our dogs that has since passed, which would explain the nails on the hardwood that we hear. We do think that one of the spirits is my grandmother, who passed away in 2015. She was an animal lover, which would explain why the dogs are so calm when staring up into the corners. Plus, the activity cooled down a little bit when we brought her ashes back out onto the shelf instead of the closet that they'd been placed in during renovations. As for the 3rd one, I'm not sure. I don't want to say it's demonic, partially for my own sanity because that would be terrifying, but also because as someone who questions the existence of God, I must also question the existence of demons. But whatever it is, it feels dark. I have always trusted a dog's measure of a person, and if my boy doesn't like it, then I definitely don't believe it to be benevolent.
This happened when I was about 5 years old, and my half-sister would have been around 2. Our family was temporarily staying at her grandparents' place in Melbourne, Australia. My bed and my sister's bed were set up on opposite corners of the lounge room. They were against the curtains, which covered windows that went from the ceiling to the floor. I also remember tall bookshelves creating shadows that loomed over me at night. They always freaked me out for some reason. I woke up one night and I saw my mom watching over my sister, with her back to me. Instantly feeling jealous, I called out to her. No response. I called out again and still no response. I shouted out the next time and she slowly turned around. I regretted calling out to her at all in that moment. She silently drifted towards me, almost as if it were in slow motion. Her face was completely expressionless and staring right through me. Nothing about her appearance made me think that it wasn't my mom, but I had an awful feeling. I hid under the covers and cried myself to sleep. I remember the suffocating feeling of breathing in hot air, which makes me think it wasn't a dream. I didn't hear anything other than my own breathing, no footsteps away or anything. I didn't experience anything else weird at that house, but I've always remembered that one night. I'm 25 now and have encountered strange coincidences over the years, but nothing this frightening.
It seems pretty boring now that I've written it out, but I was terrified at the time. This happened last year, 2021, so I remember it pretty well as it still haunts me to think about. I was coming up I-77 in West Virginia, and the weather had changed from the rain and sleet to snow and whiteouts. I was at one of the spots that us truckers pull off at. I was trying to go ahead when I felt a heavy hand grab my shoulder, and then a man kind of chuckled and said,
"Son, if you're trying to drive through, then it must be important."
I said, "Yeah, I'm going home to see my kids." He gave me a look of understanding. He said he was heading home to see his grandkids, but he was going north to I-79. I was headed north to I-64, where I-64 and I-77 split, so I-64 goes west to Kentucky. We stood there and talked about things, and he said his name was Bill, and he was going to go on. If I wanted to, I'd be safer to follow him, because he could tell I was going to go on anyway. We get in our trucks and head out. We get out about 5 or 10 miles, and the interstate starts with the mountain drops. And as we do, I see his trailer going toward the guardrail, and I'm done. Almost to a complete stop because we can only do 45 here. And I see his truck and trailer break through the guardrail, with his trailer stuck in this position. I stopped, got out. I'm going to get my chains and whatever else I had to pull him up when I see a DOT officer pull up. Where Bill and I had just met was the scale house, checking out the weather, so DOT was close. They stopped me, said that it would only pull my truck down with him. I fought back, trying to hook it up, but it was no use. I knew he was right. So I stood there, helpless. They told me that the tops of the trees had gone into the cab, killing him. And I remember thinking, why a driver with 25 years? Why not a driver like me with only 7 years, when I could have easily went off behind him? I've been past there a couple of times since, and my hands shake when I go by or when I think of that night. I think of Bill from time to time, and if not for him, I might not be alive today. So to Bill, thank you, and I'm sorry you couldn't make it home. To Bill's family, he was a good man. I'm sorry I couldn't do more to help him. I know it's not a ghost story, but not all haunts are ghosts. Some are just memories of stuff that we went through. A few years ago, I was lying in my bed trying to sleep for the night. I remember the glow of the moonlight coming through the window and the sound of music coming out of my stereo. The stereo is one that was given to me by my grandma before she passed. I've had it for as long as I can remember, because she passed away when I was only 3. I sit it next to my guitar amp on my shelf and I leave it on all day, changing the channels with my mood. Every night, I would listen to the public radio that was broadcast from the university not far away. They played everything. Classical, jazz, Motown. It was more of an oldie station than anything else. One of the most calming parts was the host. She sounded like she was no more than 25. I figured she was a university student that did the radio station for the night. She had a strangely calming voice that sounded almost like a mother calming her child.
Now we return to
to music through the night. Enjoy," she would say after the commercials were over. The sound of violins and cellos slowly faded in, and not long after it had built up into an entire symphony. I laid there, eyes closed, calmly listening to the music, when a particular scent washed over me. It was the smell of a woman's perfume. I thought it to be strange because I lived on the other end of the house from anyone who owned perfume. It was a pleasing smell. It had a unique citrusy scent with hints of lemon and orange, while still remaining feminine in nature. Brushing it off is my imagination. I closed my eyes to try to sleep again when I felt the gentle touch of a hand resting on my head, slowly running its fingers through my hair in a loving manner. I smiled and thought it was my girlfriend coming to bed. I opened my eyes slowly to see the female figure sitting next to me in the bed. She was wearing the perfume and still playing with my hair. "Looks like you finally decided to come to bed. Did you finish your TV show?" I asked, still thinking it was my girlfriend. The figure then kissed my forehead, and I fell asleep. I woke up in the bed alone, and the smell of perfume was gone. Confused, I went into the living room, only to see my girlfriend on the couch asleep, with the Netflix log-on screen still on the TV. I just shrugged it off as a dream. Fast forward a week or two, when I was helping my aunt clean out her house for moving. I was carefully placing all of her perfumes into a box, smelling each of them as I put it away. In the very back, buried behind all the other fragrances, I spotted a small green bottle. I picked it up and sprayed a little on my wrist and smelled it. It was the same perfume I had smelled in my dream. Intrigued, I took the bottle to my aunt and I asked her, "Do you know anything about this? It smells familiar." "Oh yes, I do. Your grandma, she used to wear that all the time. It was her favorite." I live in a small town in Oklahoma that's located about an hour south of Oklahoma City. In my town, there's a Baptist church that pretty much everyone in town goes to if they're religious. Although I am religious, I've never really gone to church much, but if I did, I went there. The first time I attended the church was on my 7th birthday. I went with my friend because I was celebrating the day with him, and his family wanted to attend church first. I actually really enjoyed the youth class. All of my friends were there, so we goofed off more than we learned, and that made it appealing enough for me to want to go back a dozen or so more times. When I attended the church, the preacher was a very kind old man who always knew how to make you smile. He used to call me Red, because one time he challenged all the boys to eat a small jalapeno for $10. I ate it, and he said my face was so red he could mistake me for the Kool-Aid man. Whenever he would see me come to church, he would say, "How's it hangin', Red?" And when I would leave, he would say, "Stay cool, Red." I came to become one of his favorite children in the youth group, and I grew to really admire him. So 7 years ago, I was saddened when I found out that he had died. I was 13 at the time, and was at a basketball game when a friend who went to the youth group with me had said that he died the night before from old age. He said the church was going to hold a dinner to honor his life that Sunday night, and he asked if I wanted to go. I told him yes. We get to the church, and there were cars filling up the parking lot and lining the streets. The place was so packed that they had to move tables outside. We went inside to find our friends, when one of the old ladies pulled my friend to the side. She asked my friend if he could go buy some more ice and drinks, and she gave him some money.
He said he would be happy to and left. I decided to stay to see if I could be of service, as they were still setting up for the unexpected amount of people. After a few cups of tea and a lot of Dr. Pepper, I had to use the restroom. I made my way to the restroom only to find that it was occupied. I asked one of the church leaders if I could use the one in the nursery, and they said that it was in use too, and to go ahead and use the bathroom in the preacher's office. I hustled my way there, and I made it there right when I felt like my bladder was about to explode. I get done and I start washing my hands, and I hear the door to the office open and then close. I dry off my hands, I open the door, and see that no one's in the room. My immediate thought was that someone was just checking to see if anyone was in the office. I made my way to the door, and when I was walking out of the office, I heard clear as day, "Stay cool, Red." When I was 12 years old, me and my family got into a bad living situation. We got evicted, and we had nowhere to go. We aren't wealthy by any means, but our family, that's different. My grandparents, to be specific to this story. So after a lot of debating and many fights between my parents and I, they decided that we were going to move in with my grandparents. Where we were living, it had one bedroom, a bathroom, a TV, and 2 beds. Me and my sister would share a bed, and my parents would share the other. Okay, now a big thing is that we have 3 cats, Ginger, Angel, and Tim, and they were staying in the woodshed, which was up the hill and down a path. And to give a picture of the house, it was 3 stories, in the middle of nowhere, private property, and gated. There was a password to even get into the driveway, which went up a mountain and took about another 15 minutes to drive. My grandparents had workers that they paid by the hour: Blake, Sam, and Chad. I'd only ever met Blake, and he was really nice. He was 20 and he had a 2-year-old kid. One day, when I was going out to feed the cats, I saw a guy come out of the shed. He asked me if I needed a ride back to the house or if I wanted to walk. He said my name and told me that my grandparents had a big Christmas present coming for me, since it was around that time of year. I said I was good and that I could walk. He said okay, and he gave me the key to the shed. I fed the cats, and then I walked back. At dinner that night, I brought up the man, and my grandparents went white. No one was working that day, and no one, other than Blake, knew who I was. The so-called Christmas present, it was real, but they hadn't told anyone about it. They had the key to the shed, and they even had the spare, which was kept under a gas can in the basement. After that, my grandparents got their guns and went out. They searched the entire property for hours, and they didn't find anyone. How did he know my name?
When I was 16, my best friend died, Julia. She was an absolutely fantastic human being, and even to this day, it pains me that I won't ever see her again, at least not until I'm on my way out of this place, the land of the living. When I was 20, I got pregnant with my first child, my daughter. For some reason, I constantly had dreams about Julia. Most people had pregnancy dreams, like about being pregnant, but I had dreams about her almost every night. It was truly heartbreaking to wake up sometimes and realize it was all a dream, Later in my pregnancy, closer to my delivery date, I had a dream about Julia. This dream was a little different. I was watching her sit by my bedside, and I was watching me lay there in my bed, asleep. I walked closer and I could hear Julia saying something, but I couldn't quite make it out, so I got even closer to her. I remember it seemed to take me forever to get to her. Once I did, she wasn't looking at me. Well, she was looking at the sleeping me, but not the one that was awake in front of her. Just remember, you shouldn't go. Don't let Danny go either. It's going to seem like a really good idea, but you can't go. Just remember, you shouldn't go. I watched her the whole time she spoke. She was speaking with such seriousness. The lightheartedness I'd once felt from my dreams was sort of gone, and then I was awake. But I could still faintly hear, "Don't let Danny go either. It's going to seem like a really good idea." And then it was just the silence of the morning. Danny is my husband. The whole morning I couldn't really shake my dream, but I knew people had strange pregnancy dreams all the time. I just figured that this was my weird dream, since all of my dreams were about Julia anyways. New thoughts and pregnancy brain took over for the rest of the day. That night, I had the worst insomnia. It happened on occasion, but on this night, I couldn't bear it. It was almost midnight, with zero luck, and my husband looked over at me and said, "Oh, babe, we could catch the premiere of The Dark Knight Rises." I immediately thought, oh, that's a really good idea. Movies help me sleep, and if not, at least I'd be entertained. But it was that feeling, the feeling that this was a really good idea. It triggered something, my dream, and what Julia had said. Instead of agreeing that it was a good idea, I said I didn't think we should go out tonight, that I should probably just try to get some sleep. We turned on some meditation music and essentially counted sheep until I was out. I woke up the next morning, July 21st, 2012, and was completely sickened by the news being reported in our town. It had made national headlines by this time, and I woke my husband up, bawling. I just couldn't believe what I was seeing. I tried to tell him what was wrong, but instead, I just went into my dream about Julia, what she had been saying, and how I knew what she meant now. And oh my God, how awful. He was trying to console me while also trying to turn on the bedroom TV. "Oh my God," I heard him say, and he hugged me tighter and tighter while repeating the phrase, "Oh my God. Oh my God." We lived in Aurora, Colorado. We lived in the community directly impacted by the shootings that took place that night at the premiere. It was a heartbreaking ordeal, to say the least. Truly terrible for so many families. Unnecessary violence destroys a lot. People tell me I was touched by an angel. And I'll tell you what, I don't know about heaven and all of that, but I believe we take care of the ones we love when we pass on, sometimes silently from the sidelines. But on those rare occasions, you might really get through, and you might truly change the course of an entire family's life. I'm so grateful to my forever friend, Julia. It only seemed fitting to name our daughter after the woman that saved our lives. About 10 years ago, I moved into a house. My husband worked nights, so it was just me and my 4-year-old daughter at home most nights. The second day we were there, my husband built our bed. I fell asleep alone and woke up in the middle of the night to my bed violently shaking. As I'm laying there, afraid to move, I notice the handles on my dressers are flapping up and down. I was afraid for my daughter, who was in the next room, so I jumped up out of bed and I ran to her room, but she was sound asleep. I was too afraid to sleep alone in that room, so I had my husband pull our mattress into my daughter's room so I could sleep there. In between the first incident and the last, several unexplainable things happened. Ceiling fans would rotate one way, then stop and rotate the other way. My dogs would start aggressively barking at a corner of the living room. Things would go missing and then show up in plain sight. We would smell weird smells like old lady perfume or a strong smell of popcorn where the kitchen would have been in the 1700s. I would hear footsteps in the attic, and one night, I heard the TV turn on in the spare bedroom. I go to check it out, and the TV is turning off and on. I then saw a ball of light bouncing around the room. Another night, I had 2 friends over. We were sitting in the living room, talking, while my daughter played with one of those Little People Animal Farm sets. She had a sheep in her hand and set it down in the middle of the table. As she's walking over to us, the sheep flies off the table and slams into the wall. I begged my friends not to leave, as I was terrified to be alone. The night before, I couldn't take it anymore. My husband was off of work and we had fallen asleep watching TV. He'd woken me up around 2 a.m. to tell me he was going to eat a bowl of cereal. So I went upstairs to my daughter's room where I felt the safest, and I still had my mattress on the floor. As soon as I close my eyes, I hear what sounds like her TV crashing to the floor. She had a lamp in her room that had a floor button, so I was able to turn on the light super fast. When I turned around, I saw her closet door flying open so hard it hit the wall. My daughter woke up, and we were both screaming. I left the next day and couldn't even go back inside the house to pack anything up. I had to break my lease. I told my landlord what happened, and it seemed like she already knew what was going on. She proceeded to tell me that any house can be haunted, new or old, and described how she couldn't keep a babysitter in her newly built house because it was so haunted. This house was not my first paranormal experience or my last, but it was definitely the scariest 7 months of my life. This sounds crazy, but is 100% true. I used to live in a mobile home trailer park growing up, and there was a hallway that went from one end of the trailer to the other, with the bedrooms coming off of it on the side. My bed was on the wall opposite the hallway, so I could see into the hallway, but not down either side. When I was about maybe 6 or 8 years old, if I stayed awake after my dad went to sleep and stared at the doorway, I would start to be able to make out a hand stretching from beyond the doorway in the hall from the right side to the left side of the door. The longer I looked, the more the hand would appear, until eventually, over the course of a few minutes, I could see a red and white striped shirt or sweater sleeve. If I continued to stare, after a longer period, the body of a boy would appear in the doorway. I specifically remember hiding under the covers most nights when this would happen, mostly at the first sight of him. I was never antagonized further than him slowly moving, facing my bed, from the right side of the door to the left. And if I continued to stare, he would eventually disappear
beyond the left threshold. We moved out of that trailer into a home when I'd just turned 9. And that was the end of it. I never really thought about it, and I never told my dad or anyone else about it because by the time I'd already chalked it up to just seeing things and had thought it was my imagination. I'm sure it probably was. About 15 to 20 years later, my dad and I were talking about his best friend that had lived next door, but sadly just passed away. We started talking about our trailer and the older lady that moved in after us. My dad said something like, "Funny enough, Dad's friend told me a few years ago that the woman used to see a little boy in a red and white shirt, like a ghost or something." I was obviously taken aback and told him what I had seen almost every night for a few years, and we were both just a bit shocked at what that might mean. Never experienced anything else, but that completely stumps me.
This happened when I was about 6 years old, but I still remember it very well. Like many kids that age, I was scared of the dark, to the point where a Scooby-Doo movie could give me nightmares for weeks. So I often moved to lay with my head at the foot of the bed, as it allowed me to peek out the door and into the living room, where my parents usually watched TV after tucking me in. This particular night was no different. It was dark and quiet when I woke up. My parents must have gone to bed. Then, I saw a slender woman who looked to be no older than 30. Her fair hair was long, almost down to her waist, and she wore a simple dress that reached her shins. She wasn't transparent, but she had this weird, faint glow, and she held her arms to her chest as if she was carrying a tiny infant. I knew instantly that it wasn't my mother. She had short hair, almost a bob cut, and never wore more than underwear to bed, maybe a t-shirt at most, but certainly not a long nightgown. Furthermore, my younger sister was a toddler at the time, far bigger than the infant-like thing that this woman was holding. She walked silently with her face directed down toward the infant, paying me no attention as she slowly made her way past my bedroom door. I knew it wasn't my mother, yet I felt absolutely calm, despite my usual night terror. It was as if I recognized instinctively that this woman, whoever she was not a threat to me. And so I laid still, waiting for her to return and pass by my room again. She couldn't walk more than 3 or 4 steps past my door in that direction. There was an old wooden dining table. It would seat about 8 to 12 people, blocking the way. She couldn't even walk around it either. She'd have to turn around. But no matter how long I waited, she never returned. In the end, I got tired of waiting, and I got out of bed to check it out. Nothing. There was no one in the living room, nor the kitchen. I even went to check on my parents, who were sound asleep. Puzzled, I headed back to bed and eventually fell asleep. I asked my parents at breakfast the following morning who the lady from last night was, as I'd never seen her before. Had they held a late-night get-together? But my parents had no clue what I was talking about, and I ended up just shrugging it off. I never saw her again, but my fear of the dark ended soon after, as if the encounter had somehow assured me. And more than 2 decades later, I still feel her presence in the house. My parents and sister have noticed it too, although they've never seen her. Sometimes we all joke about it, except my sister, who feels uncomfortable and creeped out about it. My childhood home isn't particularly old, but it had been owned a few times before my parents purchased it in their late 20s. We're not religious, and I don't know who or what she could be, but the house would feel oddly empty without her, and I like the small signs of her being there. I do wonder, however. I hope this story brings you as many chills as it did me as I remembered it, typing it out. Sometime when I was in my early 20s, between the years 2009 and 2010 to be exact, I took a vacation from my home in the south of Japan to a sleepy little seaside town called Shimabara. Needless to say, Shimabara is a town that is friendly, but the air is quite heavy, even without knowing the magnitude of history beforehand. It's also very, very, very old. For this instance, I will tell you, it was summer, and we were on our way walking to a site that my mother was excited to see. The Nihonzo statue. It's a Buddha in a reclining position. It's not the biggest, but my mother, being a Buddhist, on top of a lover of history, had been looking forward to it this entire weekend that we were staying there. Admittedly, for the same reasons I was too. The phone GPS I was using to get us there took us through an open strip mall, littered with freshwater springs that had cups for guests to take drinks, which was a reprieve considering the humid weather. And into the temple, surrounded by a graveyard, is where we went. Now, it's not unusual for temples and graveyards to coexist, especially in the countryside. They're not common, but not unusual. It is unusual, however, to build a statue of worship or enlightenment in the middle of a graveyard. That alone began to set a very uneasy feeling in me, but not enough that I was very alarmed. The Nihonzo itself was at the top of a hill, which surprisingly was also the center of the graveyard. The entire slope up to it was surrounded by family plots, with the newest and biggest at the bottom, and getting older toward the top. Some of the graves at the top were so old that they'd lost whatever shape they were supposed to have, looking like rounded, rotted teeth, with their carvings either taken over by moss or washed away completely into unintelligible messes. Now, call me morbid, but I found far more interest in the graves than the Nihonzo by this point. Leaving my parents to take pictures and admire the bronze work, I wandered off to the steps just below to see the graves. If I looked over the crest of the hill, I could see the city stretching out and slivers of the ocean in the horizon. I didn't know why, but there was something beautiful but foreboding about watching the sea. I decided to look instead at the graves and try to see if there was anything at all that I could read. As I'm studying the barest scratches that pass themselves as family names, I notice movement to the right side of me, on the side that is open towards the sea and coming down from the Nihonzo. I turn my head just enough to make out what it is and quickly keep my head bowed with reverence. There's a monk leading a procession of what looked to be 3 mourners. The one at the front carrying the urn of ashes. The mourners are all dressed in black, heads hung low, and I have enough respect in me to move a little more to the opposite side and keep my head bowed to show respect for them. I failed to notice there was no chanting. There was no sound at all. No footsteps against the very much stone pathway. The monk's sandals, by all reason, should make noise. Geta are not stealthy by any means, but by my reasoning, mourners and a monk aren't unheard of in a graveyard, and when enough space between them and myself to be deemed respectable has passed, I move back to what I was doing. I find my gaze wandering down the rows of graves I'm in. Every plot is old. Some are even older, less identifiable than the one I'm examining. I look back and darkness catches my eye behind the grave, almost thinking I was blocking a mourner somehow, I raise just my eyes and see, well, it. What gender it was, I can't tell you. I can't tell you it was human, though its body faded somewhere around the thighs, so there was no feet. Its hair was long, past the shoulders, and stringy, very black. Its clothes, though, honestly, it didn't even have the folds of clothes so much as appear that everything from its neck down was simply a black shadow in its former human shape. The nose was bulbous, with the ridge having a small bump, but mostly, I remember the eyes. They were wide with rage and hate. Its head hung low, as if being forced to bow to someone it loathed. And I could see the whites all around, such dark, hateful eyes. I glanced down the rows of old graves and saw every one of them had the same shadow. It watched me as I sidestepped out of the row and into the main path, where my mother found me. She was already looking at me strangely, asking me why I looked so pale. She likely thought it was one of my many health issues. I, instead of answering, asked her about the funeral procession that passed me by. Her answer still gives me chills. What funeral? There's been no one here, not even the priest. I immediately told her about what I saw, and she responded by telling me that we were leaving right then, and that until we got out of the temple grounds, I wasn't allowed to speak to anyone. I obeyed. Now, here's the historical fun part. If you're old enough to remember the 90s, then Shimabara might ring a bell. It's the location of Mount Unzen, a very much still active volcano that erupted back then. It isn't the first time the town had been blasted by the pyroclastic flow of the volcano either. It's erupted at least 3 times since towns were built around it, with the worst of it during the Edo period, where the eruption not only destroyed the towns, but caused a mega tsunami that swept many out into the Ariake Sea, where bodies would wash ashore as far as Kumamoto. Summer is regarded as a time where the veil between spirit and physical begins to wane, with the thinnest being in August. For my town, other places might celebrate on a different day or different month when the festival Obon, or Day of the Dead, takes place. It's popular to tell ghost stories during the summer, as it's believed the chill you can get will help you with the heat, but too many and you'll summon a ghost. This story takes place when I was in 6th grade. I'm 21 now. I lived with my mom and my brother in a small but pretty house. When you enter the house, you have a small place to leave your shoes, then a big wooden door to slide, and enter the living room. On the left is a hallway. When you enter the hallway, on the right is the kitchen, and on the left, the bathroom. At the end of the hallway, there are 2 bedrooms. My mother's on the right, and mine, which I shared with my brother, also on the right. The living room floor and hallway floor are made from a different material. The living room floor is more squeaky. This is important for the story. It was early in the morning. My mom went to work and she drove my brother to school. I also had school, but mine started like 30 minutes later than my brother. So I stayed home and I watched cartoons. I was laying in bed with my doors open, the doors behind me. As I was watching TV, I heard Mom's bedroom door opening. It was very loud, like someone was in a hurry. Then footsteps in the hallway, going to the living room. I could hear when footsteps got to the living room, since the floor began to squeak. Then, the big wooden door sliding. And after that, nothing. Silence. I was terrified, in a fetal position on my bed, looking for my phone in the bed sheets. Once I found it, I text my mom, "Someone is in the house." She responded, "Are you joking?" I said, "No, come home fast, I'm scared." She sent the neighbor to check on me. The main door and the big wooden doors were closed, but my mom's door was wide open. I still don't know what happened. If this was the only occurrence, I wouldn't even care, but something is definitely in that house. I have a few more stories, so if you're interested, I'll share them. I moved to a remodeled schoolhouse in Oregon, USA, when I was 3 or 4 years old, and I grew up in this house. Original schoolhouse was built in 1870, when Oregon was a legit frontier. The original settlers owned the mountain, meaning most of the residents could track their lineage to the original settlers. We were very much outsiders. The original schoolhouse burned down twice in its original location, which was about 1/4 a mile from the new schoolhouse, which was built in the 1920s. The original location is also where the community graveyard is. My bedroom was the original boys' dressing room in the school. When you walked out of my room, you would walk onto a stage, which had been converted to a living room. There were some instances that were pretty odd, but we'll just start with this. The house had a real bad vibe. There are particular areas that it felt like someone was sneaking up behind you or chasing you. What really traumatized me was the dreams. I remember 3 in particular that were very strange. One, I had a bad dream and went into my parents' room. I just remember being upset. They put a sleeping bag at the bottom of the bed. As I was in the sleeping bag, I started to feel pinching coming from under me. It didn't say that it was the devil, but I fucking knew it was. It said to me, "Your parents can't protect you from me," in a voice that again was pure evil. When I was 13, my parents remodeled my room, and we had hardwood floors. When they remodeled, they noticed floor access to under the house, in my closet. In other words, there was a trap door in my closet. Of course, I'm interested. Open it up, look in there, and go to sleep. I wake up in a dream where I'm in the fetal position in my closet, and I'm just hearing a terrible, terrible noise. I'm scared to look up. It's like if you've ever seen someone gasping for air. That's the best way I can describe it. It's a deep, disturbing, grunting noise. I peer up to look and see what it is, and I see a man with hair, long and blonde, looked like Kurt Cobain. His head was looking at his toes, so I couldn't really see his face. It was covered in wet hair. He's soaked. Leather jacket, logging clothes. He was holding an axe in one hand, looking at his feet, making this god-awful noise. It really fucked me up. Did I mention this was an old logging community? Well, last dream I had was a great one, but very strange. My grandma passed, and a couple days later, I had the most lucid dream I've had in my life. It was simply my grandmother holding me by both shoulders, saying, "Take care of your mom," over and over again. Later in my life, the advice had great relevance. Unsure if anyone will find this interesting, but I can pretty well assume some really bad stuff happened in that schoolhouse. There were also doors and entrances to the attic that were boarded up and made into walls. Considering most families inbred up there at the time, just get the feeling that there was some pretty foul shit that happened, especially in the frontier days. This story begins about 6 years ago, after the peak of paranormal activity started to die out. It started with random noises, which weren't really too out of the ordinary, so we ignored it. But it began getting more intense when we began hearing the front door closing and loud footsteps leading up and down the staircase. Technological glitches began happening. The TV randomly turning off or a light flickering. My new Xbox experienced glitches after bringing it home for the first time. Nothing too strange. But things began getting even weirder. Me and my family had been on vacation, and when we got home, everything seemed normal, except one thing. There were handprints and tiny footprints littered across the TV screen, imprinted into the random thick layer of dust. We'd only been gone for about a week, but the dust across the TV and cabinet made it seem as though we'd been gone for at least a month. There were 2 huge handprints, much larger than the average male hands. My hand could easily fit its palm alone. The fingers appeared to be broken, going off in strange directions. The other prints were even more strange. 2 small footprints accompanied by just as small handprints. We all stood in the living room for a few minutes, staring at the prints, trying to make sense of it. But we couldn't. My mother eventually wiped the dust away, and the terrifying prints eventually slipped our minds. This was the first encounter we had with Mac. And for a while, things seemed to be okay. But then I got home one day from school, and I got into the shower. When I was about to get out, I heard the front door open and close, and loud work boots stomping up the stairs and heading into the kitchen. I had assumed my father had gotten home and said hi as I walked into my room. After getting dressed, I walked about trying to find my father, but he was nowhere in sight, nowhere in the house. And when I went to check outside, the front door, it was still locked from when I got home. I gave up my search, assuming that he just needed to grab something. But as soon as I began to relax, I heard his truck backing up in the driveway. I walked outside and jokingly said, "Leave something at work?" He just looked at me confused and asked what I was talking about. So I said, "You just came home a few minutes ago. I heard you walking up the stairs, and then you were just gone." He informed me that he had not been home since this morning. Thinking back to when I heard the door open, I hadn't heard his very loud truck pull up, and I didn't hear anyone leave. This happened a few more times, and there were a few times I got home or was relaxing, only to find the front door was wide open. This continued for weeks, and then I finally saw him. I was home alone one night, sitting in the living room, watching my shows when the TV began acting out. I assumed the antennas were messed up, so when I went to adjust them, I saw him standing at the end of the hallway, out of the corner of my eye. He was tall, almost reaching the ceiling. He had a top hat on his head, and he wore black pants, a white button-down shirt, and what looked like a black vest. And then, in an instant, he was gone. I adjusted the TV, and the rest of the night was normal. From then on, everything kind of just went on the same. The footsteps, the door opening and closing, the lights flickering. And every great now and then, a stray handprint of his was found about the house. But mostly, any time we brought in any new electronics or strange items, he'd feel the need to mess with it, test it out, and see how it ran until he could understand it. Usually it only took him a few weeks and he never touched it again. So, this is the story of how I became to know Mac, the tall, broken man. Where I'm from, there's railroad tracks that separate the reservation from the surrounding cities. And it's a pretty popular railroad. Trains roll through on a super regular basis, and there's a lot of emphasis to stay off the tracks and anything surrounding the tracks. But naturally, people don't listen. And my family's house sits right above those tracks. So I've had my fair share of close calls. Well, when I was 19, it was my first year living away from home, but that summer I decided to go home for a visit. While there, I heard from everyone that there was an accident on the tracks. It took place a few weeks earlier. A few kids, young teens really, were playing the game of waiting until the last minute to jump off the tracks. One of those few didn't make it on time, and he was killed. My mom told me that when the accident happened, she could actually hear the group of kids screaming. She wasn't the first to call 911, just one of many. When someone dies on the tracks or there's an accident on the tracks, they actually have to reroute several trains and close down the tracks for an inexplicable amount of time. My mom tells me that when she was standing on our deck late after the accident, she heard the train. She was confused because the tracks weren't open yet. So she tried to stare in either direction of the tracks to see where it was coming from. She didn't see any lights. She saw no train. But as she stood there a moment, she said she saw something glowing down below on the tracks. She tells me that as she focused on the light, she realized it was the silhouette of a boy. I asked her if it looked like the boy who'd been killed. She told me that she didn't know what the boy looked like, but that she was sure it was a young man. I didn't question this. It may seem strange to some, but my mom's seen spirits my whole life. She's always telling me not to be afraid of spirits. And for the most part, I've always felt that way. Not afraid. But seeing something. Actually seeing something. I wasn't scared per se. I was frozen. On the second night that I was home, I decided to take a walk along the tracks. Not on them, but on the man-made path that runs along the side where our houses sit. My plan was to smoke a joint, but I didn't get that far. As soon as I made it to the path where I could physically see the tracks, before I could light the joint, I saw a flash of light to my right, on the tracks. Then I just remember standing there, frozen, staring at the glowing silhouette of a young man. I didn't move, but he did. His head was moving from side to side. His mouth was moving, but I didn't hear anything, and I didn't get closer. Right when I felt like I could move, I did. I turned around and I started to run back up the hill. Midway, I stopped because I started to feel guilty. Like a genuine pit in my stomach, not grounded in fear, but guilt. I turned around and I could still see the light. I walked back down the hill and I walked towards the boy's silhouette. He faces me and I can see that his eyes meet mine. I don't see the detail or the color in his eyes, but I can feel that we're making eye contact. Something told me to close my eyes. The moment I did, I saw a name appear in my mind's eye. Riley. And as I said it out loud, I could see the light go away. My eyes were closed at the time, but I could see the change in light, so I opened them. I was now alone. I looked around for the light, but it wasn't there. I said aloud again, Riley, 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 but there was nothing. I found a tree trunk that was laying horizontally, and I sat there for a while, waiting for him to come back. It didn't happen, so I eventually went back inside and fell asleep. That night I had a dream that I was sitting on the same tree trunk, but Riley was sitting next to me. We were smoking that joint, and he told me he wasn't even supposed to go to the tracks that day. He had plans with his dad, who had to cancel last minute. I remember trying to comfort him and also saying, "So this shouldn't have happened to you?" He looked at me and he smiled and he said, "No, it should. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." And then I woke up. Just to be sure I was truly dreaming, I checked the joint, and sure enough, it was still a full joint. But what about the rest? That definitely happened. My shoes still had mud on them. Over breakfast, I asked my mom, "So you don't know what the kid looked like, right? The one that died on the tracks. But do you know his name?" She tells me that again, she didn't know the boy, but that the family had put a memorial on the side of the tracks, down a ways where he was actually hit. She told me that her and my father went to lay some roses from their garden, and she said that the cross had a name carved in. Riley. When I was 8 years old, my parents moved the three of us into a house for the first time in my life. Up until then, we'd lived in a trailer park for senior citizens because that's all we could afford. And the management there hated that I was living there. Shortly after moving, my parents divorced, my mom moved out, and my dad met and moved in with my stepmom and her 3 daughters. In total, my dad and I were in that house for 6 years, and things really didn't start happening, at least not that we noticed, until about the 2nd year. From then on, it snowballed out of control with paranormal events. Of everything that happened there, this is one of the strangest, and thankfully I didn't experience it. My dad did, a couple of times, as well as 2 other people, all of which didn't know the others were experiencing it until they later spoke about it together. The many other stories can be for another time, but this one is just about my room. The only things I experienced in that room were, at one point, terrible dreams that would wake me up in a cold sweat, panting, trying to catch my breath. I had never had dreams like that before or since. The room, when that happened, would be so electrically charged, I couldn't stay in it. It was the thickest air I've ever experienced anywhere, for any reason, ever. The worse it got, I refused to go in there for 3 months. I slept on the living room couch, and if I needed anything from my room, I ran in, felt the thick air, got what I needed, and ran out. Going through the door from the hallway to my room was like walking into a wall. The air was that thick. But then, that thing that those 3 experienced happened. And that was at the very end of our stay there, when things were absolutely terrible. My dad and stepmom were on the verge of a divorce. She was running around on him with everyone in town, drinking and doing all the drugs that she could get her hands on. So, she was gone most of the time. At this point, I was living with my mom because things at the house were just too bad. I was 14 then. My 2 oldest stepsisters had moved out, to where I don't know, and my youngest stepsister was the only other one living in the house at the time, though she was also gone at somebody else's place, usually. So my dad and stepmom were the only 2 regular inhabitants. And like I said, even she was gone most of the time, partying with everyone. My dad maintained his job through all of this, and I still salute him for it. He was a garbage man and got up at 3 a.m. to be at work by 4 to start his shift, and he was usually home by 9 or 10 as he would fly through his routes. When he'd come home in the mornings, he would catch whatever guy my stepmom had brought back to the house to sleep with, jumping out of different windows, usually my bedroom windows. So, my dad nailed every window in the house shut. My dad had also taken to sleeping on the couch because he didn't want to sleep in his bed where his wife was cheating on him. He told me of these terrible dreams he had while sleeping on the couch, where he would be surrounded by starving children, all reaching up to him, and then he'd be laying on the couch with all of them around him, reaching out to him with worms crawling out of their mouths and noses. But then, one night, a slam woke him up. He jumped up expecting his wife to be there with some guy, but he was alone. He said my bedroom door, which had always been open, was suddenly shut, and it was shaking as if someone were trying to get out. He thought it was her messing with him. He grabbed a baseball bat that he kept next to the couch, and he walked down the hall. He said he could hear both of my windows opening and slamming shut, as well as both of my closet doors opening and slamming shut, while my bedroom door was still shaking. He called out her name and asked if it was her. All of the noise stopped. He carefully opened the door and looked in. Nobody was in there. He walked in to inspect and saw that both windows were still nailed shut and the closet doors closed. As soon as he exited the room, the door slammed shut behind him, and the noises continued. He went to the living room, turned on the TV, and turned the volume all the way up to drown out the noise, and sat there, watching TV until he had to go to work at 4 a.m. The noise continued until he left for work. It happened to him several times. A while later, he ran into his wife at the bar. They had already decided to not try to make the marriage work and were actually getting along better. She brought it up first and told my dad that she had experienced exactly what he had. A few nights later, my dad let a friend of his, an older man who had no place to stay, crash at the house. The next day, he asked my dad why someone was in my bedroom, slamming the doors all night. So this happened when I was a kid, and my family and I lived in North Carolina. Our house was surrounded by woods, and there were only a few neighbors around us. Every once in a while during the night, at around midnight, I would just lay in bed, but I couldn't sleep. I felt a creepy vibe, like something or someone was watching me. Sometimes I would hear footsteps coming from the attic above my bedroom. It sounded like someone was walking around. One time, I went outside my bedroom into the hallway, but everyone in my family was sleeping and their doors were closed. So I went back to my bedroom and closed the door. I was laying in my bed again, and I heard the footsteps in the attic. Then I heard something fall in my closet. I was so scared that I ran into my parents' bedroom and woke them up. They were confused at first, but then I explained to them what I heard. My mom and dad said it was probably just my imagination, and they didn't believe me. They walked with me back to my bedroom. They looked around my bedroom and then went inside my closet. There was a board game that had spilled all over the closet floor. It was in the back of the shelf at the top of my closet, so there was no way it could have fallen without someone pushing it off. My parents helped me clean it up and put it back on the shelf. They said there was nothing to be scared of, and they put me back to bed. They went back to bed too, and a few minutes after they left, I heard someone whispering something. It sounded like they were calling my name. Then I saw a shadow that looked like a person walking across the wall by my closet. I thought it was a ghost, and I started freaking out again. I grabbed my pillow and blanket, and I went to sleep on my parents' bedroom floor. After that, I slept on their floor for a few more nights. Eventually, I went back to sleeping in my bedroom, and when I would lay in bed again at around midnight, I still heard the footsteps in the attic. And that continued every once in a while, until we eventually moved away. To this day, I still don't know what or who that was, but it freaks me out. When I was around the age of 5, I received a life-size doll for Christmas. On the box, the doll was called the Wispy Walker doll. It was about the same height as me, with blonde hair and overalls. The strangest part about this gift was that no one could recall who got me this doll, as it was labeled from Santa. Even years later, when I asked my family who got me the doll, no one could remember who. I instantly did not like the doll because it freaked me out. I left the doll in the back of my closet, far away from all of my other toys. Years passed and the doll remained in the back of my closet, untouched. When I was about 7 years old, I began to play hide and seek with my mom in our home. I decided to hide behind the door in my bedroom, which is right in front of my closed closet door. I gasp when I come to find the Wispy Walker doll out of her box, placed behind my bedroom door, with one eye open and another shut. I scream and run for my mom, crying. I tell her, "Mom, Big Sis is playing a prank on me and put the walking doll behind my door to scare me." My mother, confused, explains that my sister had left for camp that morning with her class. My mom walks over to check behind the door, and there was no doll. My stomach drops, and I'm at a loss for words. "Maybe you're just seeing things," my mom told me. We opened the closet to check if the doll is inside the closet. It was, but outside of its box, just standing next to it. I had never taken the doll out of its original packaging. I eventually got rid of the doll, but every time I remember this story, I get chills. So this is pretty much a summary of all the experiences I've had growing up. Starting with the orbs. I was about 12 to 14. I used to see this white orb in my room at my parents' house. I would always see it start at the floor and shoot up into the ceiling. My room was on the second floor. Now, I didn't believe in ghosts or paranormal stuff, and I've always tried to figure out ways to explain it. I used to think that maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me, since my room was always dark. That all changed when my cousin from out of town came and spent the night. As soon as I opened the door to my room to show her, she asked me, "What was that white orb?" After a while, I just stopped seeing it. Since then, a lot has happened. I've moved out, then back in, then back out again. And now, due to COVID, I had to move back in, but it's no longer my room. The darkness. During a summer when I was 14, I used to have the urge to check the kitchen before anything. Like, I know it sounds crazy, but I couldn't sleep until I stood in the kitchen, in the dark, and counted in my head to 20. I have no explanation for it. It just kind of happened. I remember I would sneak downstairs and just stand at the bottom of the stairs in the dark and quiet. Once my aunt even caught me, and that was a hard thing to try to explain to her. Sometimes I wouldn't even realize I was doing it, and it just seemed like a normal thing to me. The voice. I remember one time when I was a bit older, about 18, my parents went out of town, and it was just me and my brothers home for the weekend. That night, my brothers went out with their friends, so it was just me. I was upstairs playing games, and it was about 2 or 3 a.m. when I decided to call it quits for the night. I got thirsty and decided to go downstairs into the kitchen for a cup of water. My basement doorway was in between the stairs and the kitchen, and as I was walking past it, I heard what sounded like a woman's voice, singing. It wasn't in English and it wasn't Vietnamese, so I thought maybe my brothers had left a TV on or their computers or something. I checked both of their rooms and nothing was on. I knew that my game was already off, and I didn't have the courage to go check the basement. This happened about 13 years ago, when I was around 10 years old. Me and my little friends were always looking for some sort of trouble to get ourselves into. Our favorite was making homemade boards for communicating with ghosts. We wanted to experience something scary, or so we thought. I'm not proud of this moment, as I now realize it was extremely disrespectful for us to do, but bear in mind that I was only 10. A very small baby had passed away a couple of days after the grandma had passed away too. 2 deaths in one house must mean that we can finally communicate with a ghost. So we took our homemade board and went a little bit further from the house so we wouldn't get in trouble, but still close enough to where we could see the porch. We set everything up and grabbed each other's hands. We closed our eyes and started focusing on ghostly stuff or whatever. I felt a sudden urge to open my eyes, and I take a look at the porch of the house. There was a tall woman wearing a long black dress. She was looking down, so I couldn't see anything besides that. At first, I thought it might be the mother of the baby. People in my country wear black after a close family member's death, so it's not uncommon. She lifted her head up, and that's when I felt my heart drop, and the hair on my body just stood up. She had no face, but I could tell that she was looking right at me. You know those moments when you're terrified, but for whatever reason, you can't move, can't scream. You just watch in horror. After the initial shock, I managed to let out the most intense scream that I ever have. My friends took one look at me, then looked in the direction I was looking, and then they started screaming as well. We ran so fast we couldn't catch our breath when we got back to my house. I've never been so scared in my life. After we managed to catch our breath, I decided to ask everyone, "What did you see?" A faceless lady staring right at us. Without me telling them what I saw, That was everyone's answer. I'm not claiming that what we saw was a ghost. We were very young, and maybe there are explanations as to what happened. Maybe we wanted to see something so bad that we created a scare out of nothing. What confuses me, though, is how did we all see the exact same thing? This happened a few months back. I was home alone and just chilling in my room. My dogs often like to lay with me, and this particular day they were doing just that. My parents were at work, Dad in another city, Mom at the school that she worked at. My siblings were at school, so I know for sure no one was home. So I'm just doing my homework and I hear a couple of knocks at my door. My dogs immediately look up and stare silently toward the door. Maybe my brother was just home. I call out his name, and then I open the door when I don't hear anything. Well, you guessed it. There was no one there. Odd. The thing is, if it was a random person who just happened to break into my house, my dogs would have gone berserk. They are weirdly keen at only barking at strangers indoors. Besides, I never hear any footsteps. I double-check the time and notice it's only 10 a.m. Unless my siblings or Mom got sick, there's no way they were coming home at this time. I was later assured that no such thing happened. No one had come home. I've had a couple of odd occurrences in the home, such as things going missing and being replaced in the exact spot that you looked, only hours later. Our house was brand new when we got it and was only built on empty farmland. I used to dabble in the occult as a middle schooler, so maybe that's why. I am an American Civil War reenactor. I was attending an event deep in North Carolina cotton country at the beginning of November, where we set up camp in the original fort that was on site. One of the things reenactors do to add some authenticity to events is to send out 4 or 5 guys on what's called picket duty. It's basically a safety watch that stands guard outside the camp at night. I wasn't too terribly tired that night, so I volunteered to be one of the 4 sentries to go and stand watch that night. Now, before we go to our respective posts, we all determine a call sign. So that way, should anyone come up to us, they can call out the call sign, make their presence known, and enter the camp. Our call sign for that night was, "Oh, Virginia." Fast forward about 2 hours or so. It's now approximately 1:32 a.m. I was posted along a stretch of trenches leading up to the main fort, about 25 yards outside of camp. I was leaning against a tree, letting my mind wander, when I saw movement coming from a section of woodline. A figure emerged and began slowly making his way towards me. I snapped the position of port arms and said to the figure, "Halt, and make your presence known." The figure stopped only for a breath before saying, "I'm friendly." The figure came up to me and he revealed himself to be a middle-aged man in Confederate garb with sergeant stripes on the sleeves of his dirty jacket. I distinctly remember a strong scent of pipe tobacco coming from him. He made a brief bit of small talk with me, asking how my post was going, did I kill any Billy Yanks, so on and so forth. As he finished his conversation and began to turn, he looked back and said, "Got enough rounds in your box?" Referring to my leather cartridge box that held my blanked reenactor rounds for my musket.
I only had a few left for the day's event, so I said if he's offering, I could definitely use a few more. He dug around in his pockets for a second or two and produced 3 cartridges, and he placed them in my hand. Immediately, I knew they were live rounds. I felt the weight of the lead bullets in my hand. This is a serious no-no, as you're not allowed by any means whatsoever to bring live ammunition or bullets to a reenactment event. I stared at the cartridges in my hand for a moment, and when I looked back up to say that I could not accept these, the soldier was gone. All that was left was the smell of sweet pipe tobacco. I pocketed the rounds, finished my guard shift, and in the morning I put the 3 live rounds in my truck. I still have them now. I made a point of looking for that sergeant the following day, but to no avail. To this point, I'm unsure of the circumstances. Could it have been a fellow reenactor playing a joke? Someone trying to cause issues? Or maybe, potentially, a sergeant from a time long since past, keeping an eye out for a fellow soldier late at night. Whoever you are, Sergeant, you've stuck with me. But let's not meet under these circumstances again. Last year in October, my friend and I went to the Winchester House in San Jose for a night flashlight tour. Since it was during the Halloween season, they were playing a lot of very obviously fake background noises, such as footsteps on the top floor or voices of kids, etc. So my friend and I, who's a skeptic, were like, "Oh, how spooky," sarcastically, and we really didn't expect to experience anything. But as soon as we got halfway through the tour of the house, around the 2nd floor, we started noticing that the temperature in certain areas or rooms would drastically change, even though we didn't notice any fans nearby. We still didn't think much of it at this point, and were just casually looking with our flashlights into the rooms. I should mention that for this tour, all the lights were completely off, so everyone just has their flashlights on, pointing wherever they want to see. Now, here's where it gets creepy. At some point, we're in this room with a lot of glass doors and windows looking into exhibition rooms. The rooms were either closed off or locked. There's no one inside there, not even the workers. I was looking straight into this one room that had glass windows surrounding it. I was pointing my flashlight straight, looking around the room. I turned to the left, to this one small corner that was surrounded by glass, and I'm like a foot away from it when I notice a dark shadow right behind the glass. The more I stare at it, the more I realize it's like a shadowy face. It was like I was in a trance. I was frozen in place, and through the other side of the glass, this old, wrinkly face of a woman was staring back at me. She looked like she was wearing a sheer black cloth over her head. I could see wrinkles on her face, and her eyes were just dark and piercing. It was like we were just staring deeply at each other. I can't explain it very well, but it wasn't solid like a regular person. It was dark and almost like a shadow, except a lot more clear. I also only noticed a face, not a body. A few seconds later, I snap out of it and I scream my friend's name and run towards her. When I told her what happened, we both went back to the place where I saw the face, and we looked around the room to see if there were any workers there, if there were any projectors around. But the room was empty. And if you've ever been to that house, you know a lot of these random corners and spaces in certain rooms are barely big enough to fit a human. I was shaking so much after that, and my anxiety was getting pretty bad. I just knew what I saw,
I knew there was no way it was just my mind playing tricks on me. As we continued the tour, I started looking at the pictures of the house and the people back then, and the more you look at these pictures, you notice super creepy and demonic faces within them that just completely gave me the creeps. Maybe I was just tripping about these photos. I don't know. After that, I started taking pictures with the flash to see if I could catch anything, and my pictures were mostly coming out blurry, but I did catch this one picture that I edited, and it literally looked like the shape of a woman in a dress. I also got a live photo that shows an orb moving across the camera. I'll try to attach those photos. When I showed my boyfriend the pictures the next day, he, being a huge skeptic, said it was probably just dust or a coincidence, which I can totally agree with. Maybe it was just nothing. But looking back, all these creepy occurrences couldn't have been just a coincidence. Especially that face. I remembered all of her features so clearly. The wrinkles and the cold eyes. No way that was just a random shadow. I'm wondering if anyone else has experienced creepy things while being at the Winchester house. I grew up in the country. We had lots of strange, bizarre things happen to us during that time. Aliens, paranormal, etc. I lived in a house surrounded by fields and forests, no cable or internet. Not that those were really a big thing back then anyway. So I spent most of my time outdoors. This happened when I was in my early teens. My best friend and I were driving to go bring some food to my dad and his friend, who were working late at night on some scrap metal down the way from us. To get to where they were, there were two ways to go. One was the normal paved road, and the second was a long old dirt road that people didn't really go down. The dirt road was surrounded by trees on both sides, had some sketchy, older abandoned houses on either side, and a very old cemetery at the end. After we brought the food to them, we decided to take the old dirt road back as a joke. We used to walk that road every now and then during the day, even though it creeped us out, but we tried to stay away from it at night. We were both laughing about how the other one was too scared to go down it. She was driving, and we were both laughing, listening to music when we made the turn onto the road. It was a right-hand turn, so in order to make the full turn, she had to sweep her headlights across the cemetery. I remember looking at the graves, and that's when I saw her. It was an all-white figure in the shape of a female with a long dress and long hair. She was standing between the cemetery and the forest. I stared at her for what I felt was 5 to 10 seconds before she vanished, and then I continued to stare at that spot for a good 10 seconds longer. Once I kind of came out of it, I realized that the car was stopped. I have no idea for how long. My friend and I were both very quiet, and we both kind of looked at each other like, what the hell? Neither one of us really said anything for a while, but I finally asked her if she had seen something, and she said she did. Not wanting to say what I saw first, I asked her what she saw, and she described the figure exactly as I had above. Interestingly, none of us were afraid. I remember when I saw her, everything kind of went into slow motion. Even when there was music going on in the car, it was quiet, and I definitely don't remember the car slowing down and stopping. I remember being in awe and thinking she radiated beauty, and she still crosses my mind to this day. I've been back there many times during the night and day, and I haven't seen anything like it since. Anyways, thanks for reading if you're still with me. It's nice to be able to share these stories in a serious way,
without people looking at you like you've lost your mind. Haunted by a man who wanted us to find his family pictures? The title alone sounds very odd, but hopefully this will all make sense by the end. My family and I have lived in our current house for about 10 years. Shortly after it was built, the owners put it on the market and we moved in a year later. Before the house was built, it was part of a large field owned by a farmer who lives behind us. There was never any sort of activity in this house before the past month. We've lived in a haunted house before, the kind where you feel you're being watched, footsteps, voices, the works. This house felt like a relief the moment we stepped in because there was nothing. And how could there be? It's so new. Well, last month, after my siblings had gone off to school, I heard very distinct footsteps to the upper level of the house, followed by a voice of an unspecified gender calling, "Hey," before walking down the hallway, pushing open my parents' door. It's broken. At first, I'm thinking somebody must have gotten home extremely early, or maybe the bus didn't come at all. Then I realized that wasn't the case and figured we were being robbed. While I'm internally panicking, I hear one of my dogs trot down the hallway into my parents' room. After hearing the door open, I guess, and I knew he definitely would have barked if he saw a stranger poking around. When I summoned up the courage to look around the other rooms, no one was there. I thought. A little odd, but not a ghost. It couldn't be a ghost. But then the footsteps on the stairs became more persistent. They always went up the stairs and into my parents' room. I started waking up in the middle of the night with the overwhelming feeling of being watched. Worst of all, one night I woke up to someone pushing down on my shoulder. I assumed it was my youngest sister who often gets scared at night, so without opening my eyes, I told her to go to bed. But when there was no response, I got up and found that she was sound asleep in her bed. After that, family members kept complaining of having their shirt tugged on while standing in the middle of the room. At one point, 3 of the blinds pushed down on the living room window, as if someone was looking outside at a neighbor. Like we saw the blinds move. Something was obviously going on, so my parents installed a ring device to see if they could pick up anything. They picked up a man's voice on 2 occasions, with 0 explanation. There's only one male in the house with a voice deep enough to match that, and he wasn't home when it happened. It sounded like it said, "What are you doing?" And on a separate occasion, "Look at this, babe." It was getting really, really creepy, to the point where I couldn't sleep at night from the overwhelming feeling of being watched. But then, one day shortly after that, my family went to a nearby friend's house to dig through their yard with their metal detector. In a pile of trash near the scenic byway, they found a USB with pictures of a man with his family. The wife's name was on the USB thing, and when we looked her up, we found out her husband had died a month ago, unexpectedly. I have no idea why the USB was thrown into this person's yard. Bad fight between them years ago, maybe? There's no way of ever knowing. What I do know is, once we dropped off the USB at the funeral home, the day of the man's service, all the activity in the house came to a halt. No more voices on the ring device, no more footsteps. I can sleep peacefully at night, and I don't feel watched. The house feels safe again. How this man knew to find us or knew that we would find his family pictures is beyond me. I'm just glad he was able to move on now, if that is the case of why we had this activity in the first place.
So this happened somewhere in the middle of 2017. I'm not sure as for the other countries, but here in Brazil, all houses are gated for safety. And the only places where you can find houses with their front doors leading directly to the streets are in closed condos. My friend James threw a small group hangout at his place. He lived in one of those condos with dozens of identical small houses. So it was maybe 5 or 6 of us, clutched in a tight living room, having pizza and watching some shit on TV. We were all going to have a sleepover that night, and as it is for every group hangout we have, everyone would possibly spend the night awake. It was maybe around 1 a.m. when we all decided to go for a late night walk around the condo. It's pretty safe, with tall walls and a good doorman, as all condos should. So it's always nice to walk around there. We all went slowly down the street, passing through many houses identical to his, talking quietly so we didn't wake up the neighbors. Eventually we stopped by the empty children's playground and decided to climb the little wooden jungle gym. There was enough room for all 5 or 6 of us to sit, talk, smoke, and hang out. No one around, no annoying kids, just silence and peace for us to chill. Behind this playground, there was one of the condo walls, and behind that wall, some woods with big trees looming over us. On the other side, the street, then the sidewalk, and the many identical houses. Every 2 houses, there was a light pole, lighting everything up. We were all talking about random stuff, listening to music on a very low volume on someone's phone, when eventually we ended up getting into the paranormal subject. As our topics came and went on spirits, ghosts, spooky stuff, horror movies, etc., and so forth, we noticed James, our host, get quite tense. He wasn't necessarily into the conversation and was visibly getting serious and gloomy. All of a sudden, he said something along the lines of, "Yeah, we shouldn't be talking about those things so nonchalantly and deliberately. Kind of bothers them." All of us knew that James was a medium. He'd mentioned a lot of times how he'd always see spirits and interact with entities in his childhood, but he ended up locking that away, however, still seeing stuff every now and then. Even those of us who weren't spiritual or anything respected him, and we never dared to doubt a thing that he said, mostly because of his grandma. He still lived with and cared for her. She was highly spiritual, and on many occasions confirmed that what he was saying was the truth. Therefore, when James said that, we all just nodded and changed the subject. A few minutes later, James was still a bit shook, and he said to us, "It's getting a bit late, and you're all kind of loud, guys. We're going to get called on if we stay out here. Let's go back and drink some more." We all shrugged, agreed, and hopped off the wooden house. Then, when we were all going up the street, James looked back apprehensively and said, "So, as I said, please avoid talking about that stuff that way, out of nowhere." He's been standing near that light pole, looking at us, since y'all first touched that topic. Needless to say, we all got terrified, shitless, and bolted up the street. Later on, we tried to talk him into elaborating further upon what had happened. He clarified that the male entity meant no harm and was purely looking at us as if curious. I remember questioning James why he saw it if he had blocked it out of his mind. And he said that he's been trying to sort of reconnect with the other side in hopes of seeing his deceased mother again. We haven't talked much about spirits since then. Things haven't been going well for me these last couple of years, and I've had to move back into my mom's house for the first time in 15-ish years to try to get back up on my feet. I'm really grateful for the space, and I'm trying to stay positive, but I really wish it didn't come to this. I have bad memories here, and I dread any prolonged time I have to spend here, especially when it comes to sleeping. Sorry if I go on some tangents. I'm just kind of describing some of the normal reasons this place probably creeps me out so much before I get into the actual creepy thing. Just after high school, I had a traumatic work injury, near-death fall. I moved back in just for a couple of months while I couldn't work. I had to drop out of college, get out of a lease, about 3 months before I could walk again, and 6 before I could use my left hand and forearm again. In those couple of months, I had really vivid, horrifying dreams, probably exacerbated by all of the pain relievers I was being prescribed while recovering. So bad dreams, lots of them. Sometimes falling out of bed, waking myself or others up while yelling in my sleep. Waking up drenched in sweat with my heart racing. I'd have dreams within dreams, all usually taking place in the room I was sleeping in. So when I did actually wake up, I couldn't even be sure of it. Also, I was having sleep paralysis, usually when I dozed off. If you haven't had sleep paralysis, it usually feels like your eyes are open, like after a dreamless sleep or coming out of a dream, and then you notice you can't move your body, and then you start panicking because you can't control your breath, and it's so slow and faint that you feel like you're suffocating. If I was coming out of a dream when this happened, I'd see specific parts of the usually horrifying dream mixed in with the real world, all while not being able to move or breathe or call for help. After a couple of months, things got really tense. I moved out for the next half of my life, dreaded any time I needed to look after the place overnight. It's about 2:30 a.m. now, and it's just me and this creepy house. When we moved in, I was 8 years old. I shared a room with my little sister, next to the water heater and breaker box under the stairs. In that room's closet, there was a small access door into a portion of the wall opposite the utilities. I've done some home contract work and handyman stuff over the years. I don't really know why a section of that basement wall had a crawl space in it, maybe 1.5 feet wide, and wider than any other wall in the house. I used to squirrel toys away in it until some of those toys went missing. Anyways, that room creeped me out as a child, and I ended up sleeping on a couch in a different room until enough relatives had moved out or passed on that I could have my own room, which was by the time I was in high school. Cut to a couple of years ago. I was doing some repair work for my folks over here, replacing and installing a shower vent through their roof, and I needed to kill the power to the utilities through that room. It's now used for storage. While I was in there, I remembered that little door to the wall crawl space and figured I'd take a look at it and see what the reason for it was. When I swung the closet door open, I was shocked to find that there was no access door or panel into the wall. It was just drywall, no access. I asked my dad if he took the door out or drywalled over it. He didn't remember there ever being one. I chalked this up to false memories from my childhood. Even told a few close friends about how weird it was that I was so sure there used to be a door there, because I was so sure I'd lost things in it, and I'd gotten creeped out enough to spend years not sleeping in that room. Cut to a few days ago. I've almost finished moving in. I'm putting salt in the water softener. The closet door is open, and as I'm leaving the room, I can see hinges running up the wall on the inside of the closet. So I open the closet some more and can see the door is there, just like I remembered. Impossible. It simply wasn't there a couple of years ago. and I confirmed it with people then. The hanger shelves in the closet are blocking the top of it, and there's a bunch of crap on the floor, so I'll need to move that in order to actually open the thing. Weirder, on the door of the closet is an old poster growth chart my mom used for me when I was little. I recognized it immediately, but I haven't seen or thought about it since I was really little. I don't remember it ever being hung on that door or even in that room. You wouldn't be able to check a kid's height from stuffed inside a closet and behind a hanger bar. Cut to now. I saw the light on in that room, even though I was the last one in. Both doors of the closet are closed now, again, even though I left them open. And no one's been here. No one's here. I feel like I'm going crazy. After work tomorrow, I'll empty that closet out and take pictures of the access door inside the wall and post it in a reply. Sweet dreams.
I will preface this by saying that I grew up in a very spiritual family. My mom especially had tons of stories about ghosts and spirits that she'd encountered in her life. When I was around 7 years old, my family moved into a new house. From the get-go, my mom said there was a spirit in the house, but she was friendly. It was a little old lady called Elsie. If you looked up our address online, it said that the previous tenant was named Elsie. Mom was never afraid and was adamant that Elsie was looking out for her, as my mom was diagnosed with cancer a few months after the move. On nights where my stepdad had gone out for drinks with his friends and all of us children were asleep, Mom would see a shadow pause by her doorframe before disappearing, almost as if Elsie was looking in to check on her. I remember a specific time where my family went on holiday and my uncle was house-sitting as we had 2 dogs. He called my mom in obvious panic, claiming that there was a little old woman at the top of the stairs calling his name. My mom very calmly told him that it was just Elsie. She was harmless, but if he was really worried, to carry one of my mom's crystals in his pocket and politely ask Elsie to leave him alone. As far as I'm aware, he wasn't bothered by her again. My mom had a photo of her grandfather displayed on our landing and told us that if we ever lost anything, we just needed to go to the photograph and ask great-granddad for help finding the missing item. It didn't matter if you'd been searching for your lost item for days. Without fail, asking great-granddad would always result in you finding the thing in the next half hour, even if you'd already looked everywhere. My mom died of cancer in 2011 when I was just 13. Since then, I've felt her presence around me in many different situations. I never see her, but I felt her sitting on the end of my bed to watch over me whenever I'm sick, just like she would do when she was alive and I was unwell as a child. I don't think this counts as a ghost story, but she leaves me feathers and other signs when I need a little encouragement. On the day of my graduation from university, I was upset as she was missing a day she'd always said she was massively looking forward to. As I walked out of the ceremony, a feather landed on top of my graduation cap. If I'm upset, or sometimes just talking about her, lights will flicker and sometimes blow out entirely. As far as actual ghostly sightings go, my current house is haunted by a ghost that we've called Clive. I've read somewhere that you shouldn't name ghosts as you give them more power, but Clive was a joke name that stuck. Since moving in, myself and my sisters have all heard footsteps from empty rooms. My youngest sister has had more than one friend stay over who has woken up in the middle of the night and been adamant that a tall man has been standing in a corner, staring at them. Whenever this has happened, I should explain that we haven't mentioned anything about Clive to these people. I'm the only person who lives here that's seen Clive with my own eyes. On 2 occasions, I've woken up to someone calling my name and seen a tall man walking from one end of my bedroom to the other before disappearing. On another occasion, I was sitting in my back garden having a cigarette. Our back door is glass and you can see through the living room, down the hallway, all the way to the front door. The door to the kitchen is in this hallway. I was looking into the house and I saw a tall man walk from the bottom of the stairs, through the hallway, and into the kitchen. I assumed it was my then boyfriend, so when I finished my cigarette, I went to the kitchen, expecting to see him there, but it was empty. My boyfriend was in my bedroom upstairs and was adamant that he'd been there the whole time and hadn't come downstairs. Luckily, I've never felt afraid or uncomfortable when it comes to Clive, but I have had to ask spirits to leave a couple of times, as they can scare my cat. I grew up and lived in the same house since I was 3 years old, and I only moved to a new house about a year ago. A few creepy things happened in the years I lived there, and here I'll share a few of them. When I was in elementary school, there was a bump under the carpet where my closet doors used to be. I asked my parents about it and they told me it was probably just warped wood. But I was convinced it was a dead body. Nobody could tell me otherwise. Ever since I could remember, I'd felt pressure on the foot of my bed before I'd fall asleep. The same sensation as someone walking or standing on your bed while you're lying in it. I chalked it up to an overactive imagination. But ever since my family moved to this new house and I moved into my college dorms, I have not experienced the same sensation. When I was in middle school, I was getting ready for bed as usual. The way our old house was set up was a stairway leading to the balcony, looking over the living room, and a long hallway leading to the only 3 bedrooms and a bathroom in the middle. I was walking toward the bathroom by the balcony. I turned and I saw a large, dark shadow jump from the balcony. I ran to the edge and looked down, thinking it was my brother or my dad. Nothing was at the bottom, and my dad walked out of his room and asked me what I was doing. I replied with a shocked, "Nothing." Maybe a year or 2 later, I was sitting in bed late at night, texting my friends as preteens do. My bed was a twin size, with a molded metal frame, and these wooden boards on the bottom to hold the mattress. I felt someone push up hard on the wooden boards and the mattress. I heard the boards impact on the metal frame. This scared the absolute crap out of me. It took me about 10 minutes to get the courage to look under my bed, rationalizing it as a prank my older brother was playing on me. When I looked under, nothing was there. I kept the lights on that night. Wrangler was a special cat. I know everyone says that, but he didn't belong to us. Our neighbor had a cat named Wrangler. He used to come and visit us every day. My daughter used to love reading stories to him. I have pictures of the 2 of them sitting on our porch. He seems to be truly listening. One day he came over and I noticed a horrible wound on his backside. He obviously had been in a fight. I went to my neighbors who owned him and asked if they knew about the wound. They affirmed that they knew, but felt a vet visit wasn't needed.
He's an outdoor cat. Shit happens. I was stunned. I asked for permission to take him myself, and they said, "It's your money." He went on major medications, and I had to clean and pack his wound daily. He was incredible through the whole process. In doing blood work, it was discovered he had feline AIDS. I was devastated. This meant his recovery would have to take place in our garage, away from my other cat that was inside my home. Our neighbors stopped caring for him completely, so after he fully recovered, he became our kitty. It killed me that I had to keep him indoors, but I just knew the dangers that awaited him. My daughter insisted that instead we get him a collar and a tag. It also had a bell. He seemed happy to be ours. We could always hear his collar bell ring each time he came to be fed. AIDS was horrible. He could never seem to get enough to eat. One morning, we did not hear his bell. My daughter called for him. Once in a while, he would behave this way. He was a cat after all. My daughter asked if she could go look for him. I agreed and continued to make breakfast. Suddenly, I heard my daughter screaming. She ran into our home, clutching me, sobbing. I asked, "What's wrong, honey? What's wrong?" Through sobs, she said it was Wrangler. A coyote had got to him, and he was, what was left of him, on our neighbor's lawn. I grabbed a blanket and I went to him. Almost all of him was there, albeit in pieces. Obviously, the coyotes could tell that he was ill. I scooped him up, and we buried him under his favorite tree in our yard. For weeks after, we would hear his bell ring outside the door, and we would always check. But there was never anything there. We knew it was him, our Wrangler, letting us know he was okay. When I was younger, like still slept with my parents type of young, I used to see odd things, like a man with a deformed face, or a scary wolf with red eyes. It's possible that I could have dreamt those things, but I'm not too sure. When I got a bit older, I began seeing more stuff, and there's a vivid memory I have, which scared the heck out of me. I think I was around 8 at the time. It was midnight, and I slept with my brother at this time, and the house that I lived in was 2 stories. My brother and I slept across from my parents' room, and next to my parents' room was a bathroom, along with a staircase leading downstairs. So I woke up, and I really needed to use the bathroom. I tried to run to the bathroom, when all of a sudden, I just see some person with a scythe coming up the stairs. Being a curious kid back then, I went down 1 step to see if I was just imagining it, and it continued, going up another step. I went back up a step too, ran back to my room. I still hadn't gone to the bathroom. Whatever I saw, it scared me. I tried waking up my brother, but he wouldn't wake up. I was about to do my business, so I decided to run to the bathroom. I used it, and I caught my breath in there. I left and began knocking on my parents' room, but they didn't answer. So without looking at the staircase, I ran back to my room. From there on, I don't really remember what I did or what happened. But a couple of years later, we moved into an apartment with 2 rooms. I'm currently still living in that apartment with my parents, but just a couple years after this first event, something else strange happened. I was 11, and I saw a girl standing next to my bed,
and some black gremlin-looking thing under my desk. I passed it off as some sort of dream, and I did the same when one morning I woke up early and I saw a small kid running towards my room. I had another brother at the time, but he was still a baby. I got creeped out. He looked exactly as my brother, but transparent. After seeing it, I ran back into the room, the same way the kid went. But I didn't see him. All I saw were my two brothers sleeping in their beds. My mom has seen strange stuff happen, but I'm not too sure how her story went. She saw stuff in the other house as well, but she decides to keep those stories to herself. My parents don't really like telling me about their experiences on these topics. Why? I'm not sure, but enough about them. A year passed by and I began seeing more stuff. I saw some random tall black, not skin color, just tall black shadow thing staring at me from the kitchen. I was sitting in the living room and I ran straight out of the apartment into my uncle's house, who lived nearby. My family was having carne asada, and I stayed there until my parents went back home. A while passed by and my brother, who's a bit younger than me, the same one from the time I experienced seeing death, he saw something. We were having a party that day for someone in my family, and my brother was walking home when he saw a girl hanging in a parking lot, as if the girl had committed suicide in the parking lot. There's been stories about a girl who had committed suicide due to bullying a block away from where we lived, and the girl is usually seen with a white dress walking around. I've heard her spirit is nice, but I've never gotten to see her. I didn't really think much of it, but it's just something he encountered. A couple of years passed, and I was now in high school. I woke up early one day to go get cereal until I saw some random hand waving at me. I freaked out, so I just sat there wondering if I'm seeing stuff or just imagining them. I unfortunately didn't finish my cereal since I was freaking out, but I ran to my room. Not much has happened until now. A couple of days ago, I was drinking tea around 1 a.m. I was about to watch some anime on my phone, and it was taking a while for my phone to load since my internet currently sucks due to something happening. But when I turned to look at the living room, I saw some random white head with dark black holes as eyes staring at me. Once again, I got scared and called for help. I couldn't move, and everything was getting cold. I yelled my brother's name, saying, "Please come to the kitchen." The sounds got louder until I got a call from my mom. "What's going on?" she asked. "Mom, I'm scared. Please come, I'm scared." My voice trembling. It all went quiet and went back to the way it originally was. It got warm again. Boo. My mom came in with my baby sister, and man, due to the thing I had just seen, I was scared. I even ended up crying a little. I went to my room, and a couple of minutes later I had to use the bathroom. So I went. I took my phone with me just in case. And while in the bathroom, I pulled it out, and my reflection scared the crap out of me. I was sure I was seeing stuff at this time due to what I saw, but I thought that I saw it again in the mirror. It was just my imagination. I told my mom about what happened, and soon it was 2 a.m. My dad came back from work and I slept. A couple days passed by, and today, while I was sitting with my mom, the room went cold and the lights began flickering from the kitchen to the living room. I turned around and nothing. It must have been some strange coincidence. My mom is currently getting a pastor and other people to pray for me. But I just thought that I should mention these things here. I'm not sure if I was hallucinating in some of these situations, but they're there. Something was wrong with my childhood home. I want to start off by saying that I don't really consider myself a heavy believer in the paranormal. I feel that a lot of situations can be explained by logic or science. There are some things that simply cannot be explained, though. There were 3 incidents in my childhood home that I still cannot explain to this day. If someone has experienced anything similar, feel free to give me some insight. When I was younger, maybe 10 or 11, we lived in a very large old Victorian house. The house had 5 floors, very long hallways on each floor, and old wooden flooring. There were always creepy sounds at night and weird power outages. But that can be attributed to the age of the house. We liked the house a lot. The first incident happened in the attic. We called it the attic, but in reality, it had a family room, a bathroom, a kitchen, and a guest room. The 3rd floor stairs had a landing that leads to the attic door, which takes up a flight of stairs, where you come up a long hallway on your left that leads you to the family room at the end of the hall, and a large window on your right that the moonlight would come through. When you enter the family room, there's a spiral staircase that takes you up to the top floor, which is just a small, dark room that we never really used for anything except storage. One night I was playing with my toys on the stairs of the 3rd floor, right next to the door that leads to the attic. We had a cat at the time. As I was playing, I heard scratching in the attic. Not wanting to get in trouble for her destroying a couch, I'm the one who asked for the cat. I opened the attic door and walked up the stairs to go find her. As soon as I reached the top of the stairs and turned down the long hallway, the scratching stopped and the power to the house went out. I was in total darkness. I put my back against the window and slid down, staring down the long hallway, terrified and waiting for the power to come on. As I slid down, I heard a very slow thump, thump, the sound of someone walking down the spiral staircase. The sound is unmistakable because the steps are metal. The sound continued. Right behind the family room door, I heard each step. The steps stopped. The family room door moved slightly, and I immediately felt this rush come over me. I got so cold, and my heart started beating in such a way I felt it actually move my chest. After a few seconds, the door bolted open, and something started sprinting down the hallway at me. I couldn't see a thing, but I felt the movement, that feeling you get when something is near you. I remember that was the first time I ever felt like prey. My heart was in my throat, but I screamed as loud as I could, and as soon as it got close to me, the rush went away and the cold left my body. My parents ran up the stairs, and after I told them what happened, they went to the breaker box and came up, looked all over and found no one, nothing. But the handle in the family room door was broken, and the window behind me was cracked. It's possible I cracked it, but I put my back to it just to slide down. But it was cracked at a height that I couldn't reach with my body at the time. The basement was the worst part of the house. It was one of those dreary, unfurnished concrete floor basements. It was as large as any first floor of the house, I mean truly massive. When you open the door, the short stairs look like you're going into a cellar. And when you come down the stairs, you have to walk forward for several steps in the dark to find the string of the light and pull it. Even then, that light only illuminated the immediate area, not the rest of the basement. There were several lights like this the further you go, each one with a string to pull. To the left is the rest of the basement. It goes all the way back, and then there's a cove tucked to the left where the dogs sleep. It's out of the line of sight. Since there's a small window in the cove, it casts this bluish-blackish light in the morning and nights from the moon. One early morning, around 5 a.m., I had to go feed the dogs since my dad was out of town. I hated when it was my turn because the basement always gave me terrible feelings. I would always call the dogs to meet me at the stairs so I didn't have to walk down the stairs in the dark, alone. I called for them, waited, and called again. They didn't come and there was no sound. I walked down the stairs in the dark and held my hand out to find the string to pull the light. As I reached for the light, I saw movement at the end of the basement near the cove, and my breath got caught in my chest. I pulled the light fast and the bulb popped with a quick burst of light. In that moment, I saw a man standing at the end of the basement. He didn't disappear like in the movies, though. I wish that he had. In the dark, with the silver of the moonlight, from the cove window, I could still see him standing there with his back to me. He didn't move at all, and his head was cocked to the left in such an unnatural way, at an angle where his neck had to be broken. He was probably 40 feet away from me, and I stood there, trying to force a scream through my throat that felt like it was locked up. I couldn't look away. And in those few seconds that I stared, I saw it was less of a man and more of a thing. It had white, translucent skin, looked gangly. I pissed myself standing there. I lost all control, and I think the pee snapped me out of it because as I felt the warmth on my leg, I started backing away, and as I backed away, it sprinted to the left, towards the cove where the dogs were, and I ran upstairs. I chipped my tooth falling into the stairs, still chipped to this day. I slammed the door shut and locked the latch. I called my mom down, and we called to the dogs from the top of the stairs. No response. We went down there, and both dogs were huddled together in the corner of the cove, and it took 5 minutes to get them to leave the corner and come upstairs with us. We had to pull them apart and walk them with us, holding their collars. The last experience is short and simple, but probably the worst experience I had in that house. In the same basement, there's a furnace room to the left of the stairs, about 15 feet away from the stairs. It is dark, cramped, and has all kinds of luggage and extra supplies in it. The day before Thanksgiving, we were preparing for family to arrive. My mom sent me to get Thanksgiving table decor, or whatever it's called. As I walked down the stairs, I saw the furnace room door was cracked. I stopped dead in my tracks. That door was never left open. We were always told to close it, so the dogs didn't go in. Really, my parents made a big deal about it. I stayed on the stairs and stared at the door. I felt the hair on the back of my neck rise,
and my fists clench out of instinct. As I stare in the crack of the door, I see half a smile and one eye. The smile was so close to being human, but so far. I can't explain it. It was as though something had been observing humans and was mimicking a smile, but couldn't quite get its face just right. As I ran up the stairs, I heard the creak of the furnace door opening further. I slammed and locked the door, and that was the last time I ever went into the basement. From that point on, my parents never made me go back into the basement again, and delegated my basement chores to my siblings. Even though I know that they didn't believe me, it was a nice gesture that I was thankful for. Since we moved, I've never experienced anything abnormal in our houses. I'm 26 now, and I've never had any issues with the paranormal since then. I like to rationalize by telling myself it was fear and my brain playing tricks on me, but part of me knows that it wasn't. When I was a kid, besides me, my favorite uncle was the youngest in the family. He was my hero. He had just finished high school and I was like 10 or 11. We would go and visit on spring break and over the course of the summer, and I always looked forward to seeing the guy. We'd listen to records and tapes. He introduced me to bands like The Cult and In Excess, The Doors, Bowie, Stevie Ray Vaughan. As I entered my teenage years, my life started and my friends became the center of my universe. And eventually, those spring breaks and summer visits stopped happening. Eventually, I graduated high school, and around the same time, my uncle started a family. A few years out of high school, and my mom called me up to let me know my uncle had passed away. I hadn't seen him in a few years, and when I asked what had happened, the only reply I could get was, he was sick. It wasn't until years later I found out he'd taken his own life. He didn't leave a note or anything, but the general consensus was he learned he didn't have long to live, and he took the easier way out. Here's where things get interesting for me. Shortly after the funeral, I start having dreams. I'm a pretty lucid dreamer. Not in the sense that I can decide what I want to happen in a dream, but I can recall my dreams in vivid detail. Maybe there's another word for that. I don't know. Anyways, I started having dreams about my uncle. Sometimes we were just sitting in his room from when I was a kid, listening to music and making jokes. Over time, they became very strange. One dream I had, we were in a movie theater, sitting really close to the screen, and we were eating popcorn. The screen was playing something, but I couldn't distinguish what it was. And my uncle was talking, but I could not figure out what he was trying to say. Another was the two of us in a hallway, and all the doors were locked. The most troubling dream I had about the guy, which was also the most reoccurring, is when I would find him sitting at a rope bridge. He would stare at this bridge and get up and try to walk across it. But there were snakes that would strike him when he tried to cross. A snake would snip at him, and he'd go back to where he was sitting and just look at me, and then look at the bridge. So I'd walk onto this bridge and look across, and every few feet is a very angry snake, all the way across. I grabbed my uncle's hand and took him out onto the bridge, and he would be apprehensive because of the snakes. So I stood in front of him and kind of hopped up and down on the bridge. The momentum, or whatever you call it, from me bouncing on this rickety old bridge made the snakes angry. But if you bounced enough on it, the snakes would eventually teeter over the side. It was a very strange eureka
kind of dream. So my uncle would step out onto the bridge and walk a few feet, bounce the bridge so the snakes would fall off. The dream would always end with my uncle making it across the bridge and me getting this feeling of reluctance to follow him across. Then I would wake up with this overwhelming feeling of sadness. These dreams happened for almost 20 years, always the same. Me and my uncle shooting the shit, or me helping him solve a puzzle of some sort. The snake and rope bridge was the most common. Never told a soul in my family about what my uncle and I were up to. I always thought it would be upsetting, like he wasn't at rest, like he was in purgatory or something. Maybe he was. I eventually just came to accept that my uncle was haunting me, and for the most part, I didn't mind. Since my grandmother's funeral, I haven't had a single dream about my uncle, not one. I think that was the confirmation I needed, that there's something out there for us after we die. Or maybe my grandmother passing away was the catharsis I needed to let my uncle go. I look back on it now, and I like to think that my uncle was just lost. He was lost in life, and that carried on in death. I also think my grandmother, on her way to the sweet hereafter, found her baby boy, picked him up, dusted him off, and brought him home.